And
Recording
welcome.
in progress.
And we welcome everyone who's attending our meeting today, our council meeting, either by Zoom or, it's my understanding, we have some good Monterey friends at the council chambers as well. Before we get too far, I'm going to turn it over to Clementine and Nat, who will explain how to participate in our meeting. If you will do that, please.
Yes, good evening. The City of Monterey is committed to the safe attendance of its public meetings. Masks are required for all who attend in person, regardless of vaccination status, except those who are younger than 2 years old or have a medical condition that prevents wearing a mask. We ask attendees in the council chamber to keep their phones and devices muted in order to prevent audio interference and feedback with the hybrid meeting. And the City of Monterey seeks to continue to offer virtual methods for public participation in our meetings. Governor Newsom's Executive Order N-2920 remains in effect, providing greater flexibility for agencies holding public meetings during the COVID-19 pandemic. If you aren't joining us in person here in the chamber, there are two ways to virtually participate. You may join the meeting directly on Zoom Gov using the Zoom app on your computer or mobile device, and you can also call into the Zoom meeting. To join the meeting on your computer, smartphone, or telephone, use the Zoom link or telephone number on the agenda at isearchmonterey.org. Since the meeting has already started, you'll find the agenda under the Recent tab. To call into our meeting, dial toll-free 833-568-8864, and then enter meeting ID 160-125-3340 #, and if prompted to enter a participant ID, press #. Detailed instructions on using Zoom are available at monterey.org/public-meetings. To make a public comment using the Zoom app, you can virtually raise your hand by pressing the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. If you dialed in by phone, raise your hand by dialing *9 and then unmute yourself when you're called upon by dialing *6. You must do both. Public commenters will be muted until it's their turn to speak. I will call on each public speaker in the order of their hands raised. Please stay within the time limit that will be established for today's meeting, which will be shown using a countdown timer on the screen. If you're connected live on Zoom, the timer is accurate with no delay. Today's meeting is also streamed live on the city's YouTube account at youtube.com/City of Monterey with approximately 10 seconds delay, and on Comcast Channel 25, which has up to 90 seconds delay. We look forward to receiving your public comment.
That's it.
Okay, so Nat, did you have anything to add?
Nothing to add from me, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Normally we do have both of you, so thank you so much, Clementine, as always, giving us such clear directions. So we will call our meeting to order, and you can join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, and we'll wait momentarily until we do have the flag displayed on our Zoom, please. Are you able to share the screen?
Just 1 second, Mayor, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Here we go in just a second. I got used to doing the chamber version.
I got it. Good, thank you so much, Clementine. So if you can stand and join us in the pledge, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation,
under God,
indivisible,
with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, and Clementine, before we let you go, would you introduce your caring city council, please?
Yes, Councilmember Albert.
Here.
Councilmember Hoffa.
Here.
Councilmember Smith,
Here.
Councilmember Williamson,
Here.
and Mayor Roberson.
And I'm here as well. And we have one consent item. And we could probably spend a whole evening just talking about the IGSA, which is our intergovernmental support agreement. I think I got that right. And if just briefly, in the mid-90s, the city of Monterey's Defense Language Institute and Naval Postgraduate School both got on the BRAC list. And because of some very serious lobbying by our city, our friends, our city manager at the time, Fred Muir, we were successful in getting off the BRAC list. And I'm thinking our a wonderful current city manager, Hans Lusar, was probably with us during those days as well. And as a result of that, they developed a thing called the Monterey model, which started here and it's been duplicated throughout the country. And what it is, it's an agreement with the military for the city of Monterey, and in this case, many other cities and jurisdictions, to provide public works and infrastructure support to military installations, saving them a lot of money. And so, Hans, if you would please just briefly tell us what this is, an amendment, and tell us what this is, please. I think it's important for the public to know that.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is basically to allow us to extend the current intergovernmental support agreement by another full year to basically allow the Army to exercise the 5th option period, and also to allow amendment until March 2023. It will be funded over the next 12 months by approximately $13 million from the Army. Let's hope the U.S. Congress does the right thing tonight by passing hopefully a continuing resolution and probably also raising the debt ceiling, because if this doesn't happen, things like that can also go sideways for us. So this is basically just an extension of the existing IGSA. We are currently in negotiations with the Army for a new IGSA agreement, and that apparently has not been completed yet. We hope we complete it by March 2022. So again, this is exercising option year 5 to give us another year. Under the current agreement, we are renegotiating the new one. It also gives you an option, gives the Army an option to amend the contract to extend it until March 23, and that's in front of you right now.
Good, and Hans, thanks to you and our staff, as well as the Department of Defense of the Army, for working so hard on getting this agreement extended. We really appreciate it. Any council questions? Council Member Allen?
I guess my question is this something that the city manager is confident will be resolved by March of 2022? Or is this something where perhaps the intercession of our city political leaders, the city council, the mayor, and perhaps our congressperson could be of benefit? Or is this something where you feel like we will and are close to resolving it?
So we certainly appreciate the help, but I am very confident that we have a new intergovernmental service agreement in place by March 22. The reason why we don't have it together by October 21 is that there were delays on the Army side right now. The Army is really struggling. They have a lot of pressure also from their headquarters to get this done rather tomorrow than by March 22. So I really think that giving those pressure points that they have from their headquarters, we will have a successful implementation by the end of March 22.
Thank you.
All right, and seeing no other questions, Nat, are there any public comments either in the council chambers or on our Zoom?
Yes, we do have one public comment, and Clementine will be running public comment for this meeting. So if you would, please, Clementine.
Yes, and also we did receive a request right before the meeting to pull this item from consent. Just letting you know that. So
Well, I think we more or less have done that already.
okay, sounds good. It looks like we have one person requesting to speak. This is a phone caller with the last 3 digits 902. So please dial *6 to unmute yourself.
Yes, good evening. This is Nina Beatty. No, this is the wrong relationship to have with the Pentagon and its war machine. The relationship that the city has with the local military facilities is admiring. It's not critical. If someone is not part of the solution, they're part of the problem. And the city directly supports the Pentagon's missions. Its wars and bloodshed, its disrespect for national sovereignty, its new deadly weapons development and reactive weapons races that are created across the world, the cyber crimes that the Pentagon engages in, the coups and the crimes against humanity. These are offensive facilities, they're not defensive. The language and cultural training in particular is to facilitate the seduction of people in other countries to commit treason and betray their own countries so that the US can attain control. The new contract will likely have closer ties with the military. Monterey's housing problems are directly affected by the military facilities and their taxpayer-funded stipends, and local wages are driven down and good jobs taken by transient spouses of these personnel. Fixing the housing situation is not possible with the present military in here. These contracts were misrepresented to the public in the beginning as merely for what the city already does: paving and fixing streets, repairing sidewalks and sewers, replacing streetlights, when they were first put out to the public. But the city is the contractor for the military in many ways, primarily POM, as far away as San Luis Obispo County and South Monterey County. And there was a water filtration facility and a health facility that Monterey was a contractor in, working on issues regarding. Monterey doesn't do that for its own residents. So I'm asking you to be forward thinking and moral thinkers and reevaluate how Monterey deals with the Pentagon and say, is this really what you want to support? And I know there are residents here that did not know about this meeting tonight and that do not support what the Pentagon is doing to the world. And so I'm asking you not to support this contract any longer and to deny it.
Thank you, Ms. Beatty. Our next speaker looks like Jeff Davy, and you are next. Please stick with 3 minutes if you're able. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? I'm trying to speak about the next item about the rent control. Is that what we're talking about now, or am I talking too early?
This is the item right before. We can put you back on hold to speak on that item.
That'd be great. And I'm sorry for being out of place.
Thank you.
It's okay, Jeff. It's awkward, these hybrid meetings.
Well, it looks like that is all for the Zoom speakers, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Nat, anyone in the chambers wanting to speak on this?
It doesn't look like anyone's queued up for to speak on this item, the X item. Back to
All
you.
right, we'll bring it back to the council for action.
Make a
I would
motion to
move
approve.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion by Councilmember Ed and seconded by Councilmember Allen for approval. And any discussion? Okay, seeing none, then we'll do roll call, please. Back to Clementine.
Councilmember Williamson,
Yes.
Councilmember Smith,
Yes.
Councilmember Hoppa,
Yes.
Councilmember Albert,
Yes.
and Mayor Roberson.
Yes. Okay, that passes 5-0, and thank you so much. We'll go to our study session right now, and we're going to be receiving a presentation about rent control in California and potential rent stabilization measures. Also, an overview of what the city is currently doing in its housing program. And won't be any decisions made this evening because this is a study session. It's information gathering, and I would imagine we're going to have a lot of discussion from our council, questions. Also, we look forward to hearing from the public as well. And of course, affordable housing is something that is a high priority for all of us. And within the restrictions, of course, we know with water and so on. And then we have state and federal and regional partners. So it's a pretty complex issue, but I'm very glad that we're taking it by the horns and we're going to have a really thorough discussion this evening. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to our wonderful city manager, Hans, who can introduce his team.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This study session goes back to a council decision in December 2020 when council discussed to the option of learning more about rent control, rent stabilization. Council directed us at that time to come back to you with that topic sometime in the second half of 2021. That's what we are doing tonight. It is a study session. We opened up the study session at 7 o'clock instead of usually at 4 o'clock because we felt it's probably a topic of interest for a lot of folks, and many of them are probably still working when we usually are organizing and holding our study sessions at 4 p.m. So this is an unusual study session, but nevertheless, I think the topic lends itself to be as very important and to hold it at 7 p.m. tonight. Our team has collaborated with an outside attorney also to give you the latest information about rent control, rent stabilization, including giving you, I think, very interesting examples from other cities. And without further ado, I punt it over to our Community Development Director, Kim Cole, who can make the other introductions to that topic.
Thank you very much. I want to welcome everybody joining us today on this discussion of rent stabilization and rent control. Our housing division, led by Grant Leonard, has worked directly with Goldfarb and Lippman, our attorney team, to create a presentation and an overview this afternoon of this item. Since Grant has been working so closely with the team, Grant, if you could please introduce our speaker this evening, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kim. With us tonight, we have Karen from Goldfarb and Lippman. She'll do the majority of the presentation, and as she's getting ready, I'll just remind folks what's in the staff report. As most people know, Monterey is a high-priced community for rental units, and with limited supply, with some outstanding issues not related to housing, such as water, that continue to constrain housing development, all of which leads to higher rents, and have helped lead us here tonight, where we're going to learn about some of the strategies from around the state for rent stabilization. So Karen, if you're ready, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to do the presentation with you.
Yes, thank you. So as Grant said, I'm Karen Tiedemann with Goldfarb and Lippman, and I have my colleague Nazanin Salehi with me tonight, who helped prepare this presentation. So if we can get the presentation up. Thank you. And Grant, if you want to go to the next slide. So just a couple of things I want to just say one thing to begin with. So throughout this presentation, we use the terms rent control and rent stabilization pretty interchangeably. Rent stabilization is the term that most jurisdictions use these days to describe their ordinances. But for the most part, I think it can be used interchangeably with rent control. So what we want to go over tonight is what is rent control and what are just cause for evictions. Give you a little bit of the legal background without being too legalistic, and then talk about some policy options and considerations for different options you may have for tenant protection, trying to address these issues. So next slide. And actually, you can go to the thanks. So when we talk about rent stabilization, what we're talking about is a local program or ordinance that limits the amount of rent increase that a landlord can impose. And typically, the ordinances set a base rent. The base rent typically is the rent at the beginning of the tenancy. When rent ordinances are first adopted, they often include a base rent date based somewhat on the adoption date. Once the ordinance is adopted, it limits the rent increases. It typically sets an annual amount for a rent increase. It will also typically limit the frequency of rent increases. So the most common is that rents can only be increased once a year. And it will typically have a very detailed definition of what's included in rent, so that it's clear that the fees and charges that sometimes go along with a tenancy are covered in those rent increase limitations. So next slide. Often when a local jurisdiction adopts a rent stabilization ordinance, it includes a just cause for eviction ordinance. But jurisdictions do adopt a just cause for eviction ordinance just separate from a rent stabilization. I mean, essentially, a just cause for eviction is saying that tenants can't be evicted unless there's a reason for it. So property owner can't evict a tenant just because they want to, but there does have to be some stated basis for the eviction. And if you want to go to the next slide, there's sort of a standard list of reasons, and then next slide, please. So there's somewhat of a standard list for evictions, but jurisdictions deviate and may have more specific criteria. I mean, obviously, non-payment of rent, lease violations are very common, nuisance, crimes in the unit, illegal use of the unit. So sort of the typical things that you would think of where the tenant is at fault would be included as a just cause. And then there may be instances where the tenant's done nothing wrong, but the property owner has a good reason for wanting the tenant to move. Those could include that the property owner wants to move into the unit, or the property owner is making substantial renovations to the unit, or there may be demolishing the unit, removing it from the rental market. So those are typically what we call no-fault eviction causes, but those are commonly allowed in a just cause ordinance. So moving on to the theory behind a rent control ordinance. If you want to go to the next, if you want to go 2 slides, thanks. So when jurisdictions adopt a rent control or rent stabilization ordinance, they're exercising their police powers, and those police powers are granted to local jurisdictions under the California Constitution. The police powers include the right to regulate the development and the use of real property, as long as it bears a reasonable relationship to the public welfare. So when we're considering adopting these these ordinances, we are always looking for some rationale for doing it. Next slide. And then the one limitation is that you can't exercise your police powers in a way that conflicts with the general laws of the state of California. So next slide, getting into more of the weeds of the legal issue. The sort of leading case on rent control is Birkenfeld versus the city of Berkeley. Birkenfeld case is an interesting case because it provides us with sort of all of our parameters for what we can and cannot do with a rent control or rent stabilization ordinance. But in the instance of Birkenfeld, the court overturned the city of Berkeley's ordinance. So it's, as I say, it's an interesting case. So, and as that case indicates, a local policy that prohibits landlords from charging more than a maximum rent does not conflict with general state law. So that gives us our authority for adopting rent stabilization. Next slide. And the Birkenfeld decision also addresses the issue of just cause for eviction. So state law heavily regulates the process for eviction, but it does not regulate the cause for eviction. And so the Birkenfeld court upheld a local jurisdiction regulating just causes. What we can't do is add to the procedural process of an eviction process. So that's sort of the important point from the Birkenfeld case. Next slide. So in the Birkenfeld case, they also, as I said, sort of gave us the parameters for when local agencies want to adopt a rent stabilization ordinance. We don't have to find an emergency, but we do have to ensure that we provide due process. So typically what you'll find in your ordinances is some sort of hearing process for property owners and tenants. The program can't take the property, meaning essentially you have made the property unusable by the property owner. And this is where we get the concept that we have to ensure that the property owner can obtain a fair rate of return on the property. And Birkenfeld ultimately overturned Berkeley's ordinance because the process for obtaining that fair rate of return, of obtaining any rent increase, was so cumbersome that the court essentially said that it was a taking of the property. The regulations can't arbitrarily discriminate among landlords, so we always have to make sure that we're treating like situations similarly. And then we have to be concerned about preemption or conflict with state and federal law. Next slide. So since the Birkenfeld decision, which was in the early 80s, in the late 70s and early 80s, there were a fair number of jurisdictions, probably 8 or 9, that had pretty restrictive rent stabilization ordinances, including Berkeley, which went on to adopt a new ordinance that did survive judicial challenge. And somewhat as a result of those, in 1995, the Costa-Hawkins Act was adopted. And the Costa-Hawkins Act really puts some limitations on what cities can do if they want to adopt a local rent ordinance. First of all, you cannot regulate the rents on single-family homes or condominiums. Also, there's a new construction exemption. So the new construction exemption under Costa-Hawkins is any residential unit that received a certificate of occupancy after February 1st of 1995 cannot be regulated by a local jurisdiction. And then finally, Costa-Hawkins says that you can't have vacancy control. So what that means is when a tenancy is terminated or the tenant leaves, what rent control jurisdictions prior to Costa-Hawkins typically had is that the rent could not be increased when that tenant left and a new tenancy started. Since Costa-Hawkins, we have to have vacancy decontrol. So every time there's a turnover in tenancy, the rent can increase to a market rent. So that's one area of state regulation that we have to adhere to. Next slide. And then we also have the Ellis Act, which was adopted in 1985. The Ellis Act essentially prohibits local jurisdictions from adopting any regulation that would prohibit a landlord from going out of business. So if a landlord wants to terminate the tenancies in a building because the landlord just wants to stop renting the property, they have to be allowed to do that. If a landlord wants to do that, they have to terminate all of the tenancies on that property. So they can't just pick and choose. So it has to really be that you're going out of business. And next slide. But the Ellis Act does say that there are certain regulations or restrictions that a city can impose with regard to a landlord going out of business. These include noticing requirements, so you can require certain time periods of notice for the tenants. You can require relocation assistance payments to be paid to the tenants. Those relocation assistance payments have to be reasonable. There have been probably 3 or 4 cases on what is reasonable and what is unreasonable. And although the courts have not set any clear parameters, they have found payments that, you know, would conceivably reach 6 digits as being unreasonable, and payments that may adhere more to 3 or 4 months of rent to be reasonable. So those are sort of the parameters we have to work with in terms of relocation payments. Next slide. And then most recently, we have the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which was adopted by the state legislature. And this is what most of us call AB 1482. That was its bill number. Essentially, this provides statewide rent caps for a lot of rental units throughout the state. It limits the annual rent increase for units that are covered to 5% plus the consumer price index for the area, or 10%, whichever is lower. It also says rents can't be increased more than twice in 1 year, and the total of those two increases can't exceed that annual rent cap. So for Monterey, for 2021, for units that were covered, the rent cap increase was 8.8%. So certain housing is excluded from the Tenant Protection Act. This includes housing that has been built within the past 15 years. So this is interpreted to mean that this is on a rolling basis. So every year we have a new start date for that 15 years. Housing that is subject to a local rent control ordinance is also exempt. Government subsidized housing, single family homes or condominiums that are not owned by corporations, duplexes if an owner lives in the other unit, college dorms are exempt. And most recently, the act was amended so that mobile homes that are rented by corporations and in mobile home parks are now covered by the act. So the Tenant Protection Act also provides just cause for eviction. The just causes for eviction, the protection does not start until the tenant has been in the tenancy for at least 12 months or 24 months if new tenants are added. So if a roommate moves out, but a new roommate moves in, you may not be protected until 24 months. The Tenant Protection Act divides the eviction, the just causes between at-fault evictions. So as I discussed earlier, those would be your standard non-payment of rent, breach of lease, criminal activity, and then no-fault evictions. So owner move-ins, renovations, etc. If it's a no-fault eviction, the landlord has to provide relocation assistance of 1 month's rent. And local jurisdictions can have an additional relocation assistance. Once again, the Tenant Protection Act, the just cause eviction protections do not apply to housing that was built within the last 15 years or government subsidized housing, single family homes if there's no corporate ownership, mobile homes that are not owned by management, and then owner occupied single family homes with no more than 2 tenants are not covered. Also duplexes if the owner lives in one of the units, and then we have nonprofit hospitals, religious facilities, tenants who share bathrooms or a kitchen with an owner are exempt, and then educational facilities, college dormitories, etc., are exempt from the just cause. So the Tenant Protection Act does not prohibit a city from passing its own rent control ordinance or its own just cause for eviction ordinance. If the just cause for eviction or the rent control is more protective of the tenant. So it is not a preemptive state law. Next slide, I think you can go. So we wanted to talk a little bit about what policy options are available for local jurisdictions. So if you want to go to the next slide. So this is just sort of a, the classic Venn diagram of what you could possibly adopt. You can regulate rent increases, you can regulate evictions, and then there's sort of a list of other assistance or protection measures that you could adopt. And obviously you could adopt all of those. So you could adopt an ordinance that covers everything in the menu. So, and I just said you could adopt rent control and just cause. Those are sort of the classics, and we're going to discuss a few jurisdictions and what their ordinances look like. What some cities have done recently since the passage of the Tenant Protection Act is to sort of build on that act. So for instance, I've worked with a community, excuse me, that essentially adopted the Tenant Protection Act just cause provisions, but made them applicable to tenancies immediately. So it's more protective of the tenants, but beyond that, it pretty much mirrors the state law. We have some cities that are adopting tenant protection ordinances that address issues outside of the just cause and rent control issue. Then we also have a fair number of jurisdictions that are adopting tenant relocation assistance ordinances. So if the landlord wants to terminate the tenancy to renovate the property, or maybe demolish it and build something else, or an owner move in, then the local jurisdiction may adopt an ordinance saying that the property owner can do that, but they have to pay the tenant some relocation assistance to help them out. And under this sort of category, we do have some state laws that were passed in the last couple of years, SB 330, that if you are approving a housing project that requires the demolition of housing units, there are some built-in tenant protections there under state law. And then we have some jurisdictions that have adopted landlord-tenant mediation ordinances that provide an opportunity for landlords and tenants to mediate their disputes before they might go to court. So we wanted to give you some examples of what other jurisdictions are doing. And we looked for examples near you, and you'll see the next two are somewhat near Monterey. But Santa Monica, we included here because Santa Monica is sort of the classic rent control jurisdiction. Santa Monica has had rent control for quite a while. They had rent control before Costa-Hawkins and before the Ellis Act. And if you ever look at the body of law on rent control in California, you'll see a lot of cases come out of Santa Monica. So Santa Monica has a pretty classic late 70s, early 80s rent ordinance. It has just cause for eviction. They also have minimum lease terms. So property owners have to offer tenants a lease for at least 12 months is common. They require relocation assistance for no fault evictions. They require that the city be notified of all evictions. And then they regulate rent increases. They regulate both the frequency and the amount. And Santa Monica has a maximum allowable rent for every unit based on the rent history on the unit. They also have a registration requirement. The property owners have to register their units. They have an eviction process. They have defense against eviction, and then they have anti-harassment. And all of this is monitored and regulated by a rent control board in the city of Santa Monica. So just a few more specifics. They limit pass-through expenses. So pass-through expenses are if a property owner incurs an additional expense, like a capital improvement, a lot of jurisdictions will allow the property owner to pass that through to the tenants or some portion of that if it benefits the tenants. So Santa Monica limits those to a very limited category of items and to a set amount. So as you see, it's pretty low, $35 or 4%. They also have an ordinance that prohibits evictions of households that contain students during the school year for no fault reasons. So trying to increase stability for school children. And then they have an ordinance that is a minimum lease term of not less than a year, and that the lease has to be to a natural person, trying to avoid sort of corporate buyout of rental units, which is an issue in some communities. So Santa Monica, of the three we're going to look at, is probably the most restrictive. San Jose also has a rent stabilization program. It includes just cause for eviction and relocation assistance. It does include a mediation feature, but it does regulate annual increases to a set amount and the frequency of those amounts. And it does include the maximum allowable rent. So it's pretty similar to Santa Monica in a lot of its features, but it does not have a rent board. It is primarily administered by staff, and it has a pretty significant rent staff program. Next slide. They have certain exemptions. They don't cover duplexes or condominiums or in-law units, or what we now call accessory dwelling units. They also don't cover single-family homes. So, and then there are certain fees that property owners are allowed to charge under the ordinance. And they sort of set those fees, like parking spaces are $50, etc. So they are a little less restrictive than Santa Monica, but they are still a fairly restrictive regulatory scheme. Next slide. And Santa Monica also has requirements for notices of termination of tenancy that are very specific to the size of the unit. And then the final jurisdiction we wanted to talk about was East Palo Alto. East Palo Alto has also had a rent stabilization ordinance in place for quite a while, but they have, I was going to say recently because it seems recent to me, but it's probably been 15 or 20 years, they did a pretty significant update of their rent stabilization. So they are fairly similar to the other two jurisdictions in terms of what they regulate. They do have a rent control board that administers their program. Next slide. They cover all of their units except sort of the single family homes, which of course we can't, and then duplexes and triplexes, and they have a few other exemptions. They do require relocation assistance if the unit is being demolished, and in some other circumstances. So next slide. Under East Palo Alto, failure to file your eviction notice can be a defense to the eviction. And there are a few other jurisdictions that have those requirements as well. And then they have a maximum allowable rent that is certified at the beginning of each tenancy. And so the vacancy control, the landlord sets the rent, but that certificate then determines the future rent increases. So that's a way of regulating and monitoring the rent increases. So this is sort of different options to think about for tenant protection that may not be rent stabilization or rent control, but provide additional protections for tenants and build on the state law. So one thing we have seen a fair number of jurisdictions in the last couple of years adopt ordinances that require property owners to offer tenants a one-year lease that provides stability for the tenants. And then if you remember back to the just cause protections under state law, they do not come into effect until 12 months. So with a one-year lease ordinance, you're giving the tenant that sort of additional tenancy or protection. Obviously, it's always the tenant can reject the one-year lease, in which case then they go to a month-to-month is typically how these ordinances read. Another option that some jurisdictions have adopted or are considering is under the state law, tenants can be evicted if the landlord is doing substantial renovations or code enforcement that require the tenant to be out of the unit. So they require more than 30 days of work. Some jurisdictions have adopted requirements that the landlord has to have an actual permit before they can do that and show a need for complying with code enforcement. So that's an option for kind of limiting the number of substantial renovation evictions, which sometimes go up and down in different jurisdictions. And then as we talked about, some jurisdictions require more relocation assistance for a no-fault eviction. Under the state law, it is 1 month of rent. We have jurisdictions, I think the range tends to be between 3 and 4 months of rent. The city of San Francisco just has a set schedule of what you have to offer tenants. And then some jurisdictions have a higher relocation amount for certain households, for households that include seniors or the disabled. Next slide. The other options are an anti-tenant harassment or anti-retaliation policy. So this would make it unlawful for landlords to conduct certain activities, a lot of which are fairly extreme and don't happen that often, but when they happen, they can be pretty significant problems. You may have read, it's been in the last month, there was a case in San Francisco. The landlord basically made it impossible for people to live there by doing a lot of construction, leaving the units partially demolished, etc. The city of San Francisco brought a case under its anti-tenant harassment ordinance, and it's gone back and forth, and there have been some significant judgments against landlords, and then there have been some instances where the courts have not upheld the penalties. But an anti-harassment or anti-retaliation ordinance can protect the tenants from certain common situations that tenants might suffer challenges with their property owner. And then another option is a mediation program, as I said before, where landlords and tenants can either voluntarily, or in some instances, we have a couple jurisdictions where before you can go to the rent board with a rent increase petition, you have to go to mediation to see if you can resolve the dispute. Most often these are voluntary, but the city may provide the mediation service so that the landlord and tenant can resolve their disputes without having to go to court. Next slide. And then another option is a rental registry. And we are seeing cities that are adopting rental registry ordinances in conjunction with a rent control or rent stabilization ordinance. And then some cities that are adopting them without a rent stabilization or rent control ordinance in place. Typically with a rent control or rent stabilization ordinance, it requires that the property owner register the units that are covered and that they pay an annual fee that maintains that registry or other programmatic costs. In jurisdictions that don't have a rent control ordinance, there may not be a fee involved, but there may be requirements that landlords, typically it's linked with like a business license renewal, that the landlords provide certain information to the city, and the city maintains the registry. Next slide. So typical information that may be asked for is property owner name and address, the number of units, lease dates, lease terms, and rent rates. Some jurisdictions require that the landlord update the registration every time there is a turnover in the unit, so every time a new lease starts, so that the jurisdiction can sort of monitor what's happening with the unit and changes that may be going on. Next slide. So if you were to adopt something like a rent stabilization ordinance, who monitors this? And, as we've gone through the examples, as you've seen, most jurisdictions have a rent board or a committee that monitors and, enforces the rent ordinance. That committee will implement regulations. They may be the appeal board for individual rent adjustment petitions. Most of those rent boards are appointed, and typically they are appointed by the city council. There are some elected rent boards. Berkeley has an elected rent board, and I think Santa Monica and West Hollywood might. But the most common model is an appointed rent board. Most cities, the rent board or committee is supported by city staff. In Berkeley, it is a completely different entity. The rent board is an independent entity, and so it has its own staff. And then in terms of enforcement, pretty much all of these ordinances give landlords and tenants a private right of enforcement, so they can go to court and enforce the provisions. So, and then finally, how do cities fund all of this? So the most common option with rent stabilization is that there is an annual fee that is paid by the owner of the unit. And that fee is usually set based on the budget for the rent stabilization program divided by the number of units. And then in some jurisdictions, the property owner can pass a portion of that fee onto the tenants. In other jurisdictions, the cost is completely borne by the property owner. Alternatively, the city can fund it themselves using other sources of funds. But for the most part, with the rent stabilization, what we see most often is an annual fee charged to the property owner. And with that, we are available to answer questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen, for that overview of all of the ordinances. I think any questions for you are going to want to be on the, I'm getting echo here. Nat, is it echoing? Are we okay now?
We're okay, not echoing on this side, at least in the chambers.
Okay, and how about on the Zooms? Will it stop now? Well, anyway, Karen, so any questions for you would be on the legality side versus how effective is rent control, and of course there's a lot of discussion and studies out there whether it's beneficial or harmful. I've read both. So is that would be correct then? Any questions about ordinances and the legal side of this would be your bailiwick?
Yeah, I mean, I probably read all the same studies that you've read on the efficacy of rent control, and I think you can find a study to say almost anything you want about rent control.
Yes, okay, so this is a study session. It's not like a regular council meeting in that we could we would ask questions, but also it's okay for the council, unless I'm incorrect, it's okay for the council to do some discussing as well before we go to the public. One of the things I would ask for our good public who are in attendance, we have 68 attendees, and we see 6 hands up so far who want to make public comment. And I know we have people in the chambers. Nat, can you get a show of hands of how many people in the chambers wanted to speak on this sooner or later, please?
Okay, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 hands raised out of around 4 or 5 out of 17 here in the chambers.
Of course, that doesn't mean someone isn't going to talk later, but it would be helpful for us if the attendees especially could raise their hands. We're up to 8 now. That'll give us an idea of how much time that we're able to allot. We usually like to go 3 minutes, but we don't want this meeting to last till midnight, so we may have to go 2 minutes depending on the number of public comments. And also, just a reminder that this is a study session. It's an information gathering session. No decision will be made tonight, and I think obviously a deeper conversation is going to be warranted about any of the ideas that are in front of us. And so that deeper conversation may have to come at subsequent meetings or at other times, because it's a very complicated subject just from Karen's overview, and we haven't even gotten into the pros and cons and the thing and how you finance it and all that. So with all of that, and again, I'm seeing 12 attendees, thank you, who are asking to participate. So please let us know, raise your hand. It's down on the bottom of your screen. And all you have to do
As a quick reminder for the phone commenters, you can raise your hand by dialing *9.
Thank you, Clementine. That's good to know. So if you're calling in on a *9. Okay. So meanwhile, council, any questions that about what the presentation so far or comments? Let's go ahead. Questions would be good, because a lot of times we like to hear from the public before the council weighs in. But again, it's a study session. It's a conversation.
I've got some questions.
Yeah,
Yes.
Go ahead, Ed.
I'd like to hear from some of the callers first, and I may have a question or two after, because I know that there's some folks that are in the industry that are going to give us some insight.
Okay, so I could ask the council, Alan, you had just spoken momentarily. Would the
I think it's
council?
good to ask questions, because that way the people in the public hear our questions and have the
Okay.
opportunity to respond. Like once we close public comment, then they don't have a chance to do that. So I kind of feel like our questions should come first. At
I
least
like
certainly
that.
have questions.
Let's do that. Excellent point, and that's our usual format. Go ahead, Alan.
So to our consultants, would the city have legal authority, based on what you said? I think we would, but I want to confirm, to sort of set a maximum first rent. And some landlords will, for example, charge first month, last month, and a security deposit, which in some cases becomes quite a financial hurdle. Is that something that we could regulate, the amount of sort of that initial payment?
Well, that is regulated by state law, that you can't charge more than 2 months rent as part of the security deposit. So last month and a month for security deposit, but then you also can charge first month's rent. So that's why it becomes a big number if you have to pay your first month's rent. And then,
so what you're saying is it's effectively 3 months, and we really can't regulate that. That's
yeah,
established by
I
state
mean,
law.
that's the maximum. Yeah, I mean, you might, I actually, that's an interesting question. I would want to look at it and look at that statute to see whether it's a preemptive statute, but you may be able to be more restrictive.
Okay, and what about application fees? I hear from a lot of residents who feel like they're charged exorbitant application fees. Is that something that we could regulate beyond the state law?
Yes, although that's pretty regulated at this moment too. So there is some limitation as to, actual costs.
Okay,
So
and then
some of this may be education of what is allowed.
Okay. And then I wanted to confirm what I thought I heard you say. If we had a rental registry and we charge a reasonable fee for that based on the cost of kind of our rental program divided by the number of units, we could use that to pay for things like staff members who are involved in this oversight, mediation programs, and other related programs of the sort you mentioned. Is that correct?
Yeah, so typically with our rent stabilization ordinances, we charge a fee, and that covers all of the staff time of administering the ordinance and includes things like the mediation services and those types of services. So if you just had a registry, you could do that, but we do need to peg it to your actual cost. So
Okay.
we have to look at that.
Thank you very much.
I have some questions, Mayor. You're muted.
Councilmember Dan, floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. So can the city define what a fair rate of return is?
Well, yes, kind of. That's what I'll say. So the courts have not established a particular standard for what is a fair rate of return, but we do have a pretty significant body of law on what constitutes a fair rate of return. And, some cases that say that this does not provide an adequate rate of return. I mean, the most common method for determining fair rate of return is what's called the maintenance of net operating income standard. So essentially, if the property owner is maintaining their operating income that they received before the rent control went into effect with an inflation factor, then that's deemed to be a fair rate of return. And then there's exceptions to that. But that's the most common. There are some jurisdictions that look at comparability. So there are different ways of doing that. But so you do have latitude. That's the short answer. But there are some limits. And this is where the case law is pretty deep.
Thank you. My second question is around Costa-Hawkins, and I'm just thinking about single-family homes. So you cannot put an ordinance of rent control on single-family homes. Then is that correct?
That is correct.
What happens if an ADU is developed on that single-family home? Does that mean you have to change your ordinance to an R2, and now you can, or do you have to do that, or?
Well, so what Costa-Hawkins says is that you cannot regulate a unit that is separately alienable from any other unit, meaning it can be sold separate from another unit. So the whole area of ADUs is raising a really interesting issue, because the ADU law says that you can't sell the ADU separately. So if you put an ADU on a property with a single family home, does that mean it's no longer protected from rent control? That is an interpretation. And Naz, did you?
Yeah, I mean, arguably though, because it was recently constructed, it would fall within the 15-year or the 1995 date. So it would be barred from having rent control anyway, because it was issued a certificate of occupancy after February of 1995.
Right.
So actually that answers my third question, and that is, if you had 10 units and you had enough property to build another 10 units, then say those 10 units were built in the 60s or 70s, those can be under rent control, but the new ones that are placed on that property are exempt from rent control.
That's correct.
That's correct. Okay.
Yep.
I think I have one more. 1 second here. Let me just look. Yeah, the last one is there any cities that you are aware of that have implemented rent control, and then have reversed their decisions and decided not to have rent control. Has that ever happened in California?
I do think that happened, but it may have been in the 80s. So, what happened in the 70s and 80s was, a fair number of jurisdictions adopting rent control. Then we got the Ellis Act, Costa-Hawkins, the state sort of changing the playing field. And we didn't see really any jurisdictions adopting rent control until about 5 years ago. So there was this sort of gap period. And I do think, but it'll come to me at some point, but I do think in the 80s, there were some cities that repealed their rent control. There's also a feature in a fair number of the rent control ordinances. So there's a feature in Mountain View, which was a voter adopted rent control ordinance. It's one of the more recent ones, that when the vacancy rate reaches a certain level, the rent control ordinance can be suspended. So.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for answering my questions. That's it. That's all I have for now. I'm here.
Okay, great questions. Other questions from the council? Councilmember Tyler.
Yes, thanks, Mayor. My first question is just in reference to current city policy. I'm wondering what types of policies or programs that the city of Monterey has that are specifically focused on tenants.
I think your city staff is going to have to answer that.
Good punt, Karen. Grant, you want to answer that now or after we get more public comment? Are you ready for that?
Yeah, I can just say from the housing office, we monitor the city's stock of affordable rental units that are deed restricted for our inclusionary housing ordinance. And we're also operating the emergency rental assistance program. And we also fund Echo Fair Housing, which provides landlord and tenant mediation services. So those are the three ways we really address rental issues through the housing office at the moment.
Okay, but it's fair to say too that the emergency assistance program has an end in sight. It's in regards to COVID. Is that correct?
That's correct. Although the latest stimulus has extended that to the end of 2022.
Okay. Thanks, Grant. Do any other local jurisdictions have a rental registry? Do we know?
No, not that I'm aware of. We did look into that prior to the presentation. Seaside had been exploring it in January of 2020, but I think due to what happened in February and March with the pandemic, it has been not pursued. But I'll won't speak too much for Seaside on that.
For sure. And then my last question here, is there a way to regulate dependence on income and FICO scores in regards to actions by the landlords? That might be a Karen question.
So your question, I'm going to make sure I understand it, is that landlords couldn't make their decision on tenancy based on a tenant's credit score?
Or restricting that somehow, not necessarily eliminating it, but creating some restrictions around that.
I know that there are some jurisdictions that have been thinking about this. I don't know of anybody who has done so. And, I don't know of anything that prohibits it, but I do think that we would want to think about it because it is an issue of how you select your tenants, and that issue comes up. We do see this in our affordable programs that cities don't allow credit to be a factor.
Okay, that's it for me for now. Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Ed, since we're asking questions, did you want to wait still, or did you have anything you'd like to ask right now?
No, I didn't have anything I want to ask now. I want to hear from everybody first.
Okay, I just have a couple of questions here. So anything built previous to 1995 is exempt from any kind of rent control ordinance, right? With the Costa-Hawkins Act.
No, anything built after 1995
Is not,
is exempt.
is
So
exempt.
we can regulate
I had it backwards.
rents. Yeah, we can regulate rents on anything that got a CFO before February 1st, 1995.
Huh. And why is that?
Because that's when Costa-Hawkins was adopted.
Okay,
Was in
so
1995, and so the idea behind Costa-Hawkins was to address some of the concerns that had been raised that rent control deters development of new housing.
yes. Right, that's some of the research talks about that. Okay.
Right.
Do we have any idea about the housing stock in the city of Monterey that potentially would be subject to a rent control ordinance? How many obviously have to be built, no, it's rent control, have to be built before 1995 that are not single family, that are not condos? Do we have any idea? Well, you don't have to now. That could be something we can have when we discuss this further, because that would be kind of interesting to me. How many units are we really talking about? How big would the registry be?
Yes, so as thanks everyone knows, the majority of Monterey's housing stock was built before 1995. But you're absolutely right. We'd have to dive into the numbers to see how many are single family, how many are condos, how many fall under those exemptions.
Then how about our mixed use projects where it's commercial and also rental property? Karen, have you run into that situation? How would you separate the commercial from the residential?
So the residential would be covered if it was built before 1995. So, you know, residential above commercial, it would be covered.
Okay, that would be my questions at this point. Then if there's time later on, it would be one of the things I'd like to ask is what the research shows, is I'm sure all of us have done a lot of research, and there's a lot of mixed opinions out there. And so that would be an interesting discussion as well. So with that, I'm seeing 13 attendees so far with their hands raised, and we probably are still 5, 6, or 7 folks in the chambers. So seeing that, I think we're okay with our 3 minutes, because we're looking at maybe an hour of public comment. And of course, with the reminder to everyone that no decision is going to be made, and you don't have to use your whole 3 minutes. And also, if you want to weigh in more on this discussion, email us, send us things in writing, because tonight's just the beginning of a long conversation. So with that, we'll, Nat, let's go ahead and open it up. Well, I'll let you and Clementine figure out, maybe alternate those who are in the chambers, and then also those who are on Zoom.
We can do that. And we'll start with whoever would like to line up. Feel free to join us at the podium, and I'll make sure the microphone is on for you. We have a timer here.
Mr. Mayor and council members, my name is Demetrius Castros. I've lived in the city of Monterey for 26 years. My wife and I own a single family dwelling home that we all here that we live in, but we also have another house that we rent. And if I understand things correctly, my single family dwelling rental wouldn't be covered by rent control, but I still care about the city of Monterey. I do a lot of things to support it. And as we enter into this conversation, I would simply use the term, let's not think we need to build something on every corner either. A really classic example of what we should be doing is what Mr. Carl Outzen did down here in town with a Spanish design building where it's very beautiful. It's commercial down below. It's residential up above. It fits the community. I think it's down here on Monmouth and Webster. That's the kind of thing we should be encouraging. We don't want to Santa Clara-ize Monterey, because the reason we all want to live here is because of the beauty of the peninsula. And if you've been in Santa Clara County lately, there's junk built on every corner, and some of it is hideous looking. Also, I think Monterey should be the leader of the Monterey Peninsula. I mean, our name is in it. There are areas on our Monterey Peninsula where we have the land, we have the traffic capability to build affordable housing. The Fort Ord property has thousands of acres, but most of it is being used to build shopping centers. Monterey should be the leader in the community to build housing where it makes sense, where it can be done affordably, where it can be done in density housing without Santa Clara-izing any part of our peninsula. There's the land, there's the ability to do it there, there's the close access to freeways, there's a lot of things. I would, however, recommend that any costs you put on the landlords, think about that for a minute. The cost of owning a property is not cheap. You know, if somebody were to buy $1 million property in the Monterey Peninsula, even if they had $250,000 down, it would still end up costing them about $5,000 a month with the principal, interest, taxes, insurance, not to mention the maintenance. My property tax bill has 15% increases on it just from the add-ons from school districts and so forth. There's a lot of costs to think about when you do this, and a lot of these costs are added on, like the school district, when we added the measure that added $100 a month to my property taxes on my personal residence and the one on my rental. And that's going to last apparently for 30 years. So we need to think about more than just regulating landlords, because that's not the way to provide affordable housing. That'll just turn people off and it'll create problems. Let's do it in a manner that provides affordable housing. Thank you very much.
Next, we will take a public comment from the Zoom meeting, and the first person with their hand raised is Jason Reed.
Thank you. I'm Jason Reed. I own and live in a home in Old Town Monterey, which has a significant portion of rentals as well in my general neighborhood between myself and downtown. I just want to give a little bit of my experience. I was living in Santa Monica at the time that rent control went in. It was very contentious, very, very contentious. It was adopted by a vote in the city, and it took years and years to overcome that contentiousness. I think listening to the presentation by the attorneys, there are other ways to do it that is can be less contentious. I am supportive of the city stepping in to propose ways in which rents can be stabilized in the city. One of the things I learned from the ultimate success of Santa Monica's experience, me speaking as a resident there, was that the community did ultimately come together, and the community was more vibrant and stronger because of the ability to retain people living in the community when the rents were moderated. The other thing I would say is that Santa Monica and Monterey are entirely different kind of economic communities then and now. We're a suburban community. Santa Monica is very much an urban community with the pressures of that kind of employment and development needs adjacent to the city of Los Angeles, and the tremendous technology industry down there makes it more of a pressing issue there perhaps than here, and perhaps a different way in which to resolve it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Good evening. Honorable Mayor and honorable members of the City Council, Luis Osorio, resident of the City of Monterey since 1990, a former planning commissioner and other things. I'm glad to hear Mayor Clyde say that you guys have all been doing a lot of research, so you guys are all experts in the matter. You guys have been hearing about this issue too for a long time. And here we are, and we are at this juncture because really very little has been done. Monterey is a city of renters, 66%, including myself and others, are renters. So from that standpoint, it just follows logic that you want to do something to protect the majority of the city residents. And rent control is the third rail in property ownership in a capitalistic society. Capital rules. But capital has been ruling for a long time, and it has left a lot of people along the way a lot of them are residing in city streets and along the highways. So it seems to me also that from the standpoint of who are the renters here and who are the people that sustain the hospitality industry, that you need to do something. I don't know if it's rent control, and it's probably something more along the lines of tenant protection, because the landlords, with all due respect, they care for profit and they care for the investors. And then since 2008, when the big housing bubble burst, a lot of property owners who went down were bought by investor groups. And so the prices have been going up. Now the pandemic brought us to a different, a much harsh situation for a lot of people. And so, it's an issue of moral, and it's an issue of solidarity. I don't know if we talked about those in a capitalistic society because money rules, but that's where I think the issue needs to be approached from. I don't know. I just wanted to suggest a book for you, even though you're all experts. It's by a well-known researcher. It's called The New Urban Crisis: How Our Cities Are Increasing Inequality, Deepening Segregation, and Failing the Middle Class. Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from another Zoom commenter, Dorit Gersh.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. I'm just upset because 8.8% or 7% increase in rent is a lot of money. It's like anywhere from like $140 to $185 that they could raise the rent, the landlords. And that's a lot of money. So like in 3 years, this apartment here is going to be like $2,500, $2,700, when salaries are just remaining the same, and I'm 55 years old and we can't live here. Only now in this complex, only young people, young couples are moving in here. And if you're elderly, you're screwed. And that's not fair. Something needs to be done about it. And it's a lot of money to increase the rent. And I'm just upset about it. And I don't like it. And something should be done about it. I don't know what to do at this point, because I've been here before talking, and nobody does anything about this situation. And a lot of people are upset right now, the renters. Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you. Matt, we have another public commenter in the chamber.
Yes, we do. And Tom Rowley will.
Yeah, good evening, Tom Raleigh, single-family resident in Fisherman's Flats, and where my wife and I first rented a house for 2.5 years from 1968 to 1970, and subsequently bought a house, sold it, then moved back here in 1981. So I've been a resident for about 30 years this time. But anyway, I feel I have sort of a history. But when I look at the examples that the speakers portray, Monterey is about 30,000, slightly less than that. Tell us what the actual population is. And the mayor raised a good question. How many units are we talking about that are actually within the legal authority of the city to try and control with either registry or rent control or whatever? So I believe that using combinations, comparing us to Santa Monica, San Jose, and East Palo Alto are, as the former speaker said, are irrelevant. Those are big cities. We're a small city. Now, we're the leader on the peninsula. Typically, as Monterey goes, the other cities tend to follow. Not necessarily always, because we have a few wild cards like Pacific Grove and Carmel sometimes. But the thing is, we're using irrelevant comparisons when trying to figure out what we should do. We need to come down to earth and figure out what Monterey needs to do. We need to figure out and solve our water problem so we can build some affordable housing. And that's it in a nutshell. And I wish the city council would concentrate on that issue, getting us a water project where we can build on the allowable lots that we have and expanding the existing housing we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Our next speaker will be on Zoom. I hope I pronounced this correctly, Nicholas McElroy.
You did pronounce that correctly. Hi, my name is Nick. I'm actually a more recent resident in City of Monterey. I moved here during the pandemic, and I moved from Berkeley, California. I actually used to work for the rent board in Berkeley, California for the last 3+ years. So I'm very familiar with rent control, and I believe it is a good thing to adopt for cities. I think it does help with residents who are tenants, as well as landlords, to understand what their rights and responsibilities are. There's a lot of misinformation out there about, what a landlord's right is and what a tenant's right is. And I think rent control is one of the solutions. Not necessarily, in terms of rent control, in terms of restricting the rent, but definitely in terms of making sure that the units are habitable, that the tenants are not being harassed by landlords, and that they're not being unjustly evicted. I think in America today, we're seeing a trend where after the housing crisis, corporations bought up a lot of units, and so they switched their investments from, really bad home, selling bad loans to homes, to basically evicting tenants to make sure that they can turn a profit, because evictions are very fast and they're very streamlined in the courts. And so anything a local jurisdiction can do to protect tenants from eviction, to make sure that residents stay in the area, it's a good thing. So whatever you guys can do to help protect tenants, and to ensure that the people that live here can stay here if they want to, is a good thing. I think it's positive. So I'm really happy that you guys are looking at this, and I hope you guys continue to look at the different options, and I'm excited for this process. So thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Matt, do we have more speakers in the chamber?
See anyone in the chambers, please feel free to come up and speak. We don't have any at this time, but we'll let you know if any queue up.
All right, well, then moving on to the next Zoom commenter, that would be Jeff Davy. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Davy, and please go ahead. Mr. Davi, are you there? Well, maybe we can come back to Mr. Davi. How about Lindsay Knight?
Thank you.
Lindsay Knight?
Yes, hello, thank you. My name is Lindsay, and I am a 36-year-old single female who lives currently in Monterey, but I am a Carmel Valley local. I grew up here and have moved back to town a couple years ago to build a future for myself. And it makes me really sad that I don't see a future for myself here. I currently work full-time. I am an educated, hard worker. I do make a good income, between $80,000 and $90,000 a year. I make enough to save for emergencies and retirement, but I don't make enough to set aside $10,000 to $20,000 a year for the next decade of my life to be able to own a home for $700,000 in this county. I currently rent a 490 square foot, 1-bedroom apartment in New Monterey for $1,700 a month. It was built over 50 years ago. AB 1482 is a failed attempt to protect renters at an 8.8% legal rent increase a year, while wages only remain stagnant at about an average 2% increase annually. Landlords constantly come up with ways to increase rent by finding ways to remove current tenants and hike up the rents for new tenants, many of whom in the last 18 months have been moving here from the Bay Area and continue to earn their 6-figure incomes. I am in favor of rent control based on the following factors: the zip code, the square footage, and the year it was built, or otherwise the condition of the property. The middle class cannot afford to own homes here without the help of their families paying their down payments. So how is my local government that we voted in to office going to ensure that the middle class does not get priced out of this county through high rents? I am in favor of building more new ADUs in this county, so long as they are rent controlled. Additionally, until we also address a living wage among our young workers who make 45 to 55K a year, likely have student debt, and do not qualify for affordable housing, we will continue to be a town where the young, working, and middle class do not see a future for themselves. As a single female, I'd also like to see efforts to mitigate the unequal wages among women and people of color.
Thank you, Lindsay. Our next speaker will be, I'll give another try to Mr. Davi. Mr. Davi, are you there? Jeff Davi? Okay. Let's see. Next, Mr. Nelson Vega. Mr. Vega.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
I'm a landlord in Monterey, and I just caution the council that we're taking a derisive action on something that affects one section of the economy, and that's the housing. The people that rent have a diverse income stream, and the problem should be solved by addressing the whole problem. It's wages, it's high taxes, it's other items that food costs. There's no restrictions on anything else but the rent. And the factor is that most rents are based on a cap rate, which means it's a return. And most properties in Monterey, based on the value of what they're worth, only return the landlord approximately 5%. If you lower that by continue to disincentivize new construction, you will not get new construction because those rents will be higher. I just did mixed land use in Seaside, and I'm exempt from any rent control because it's all brand new upstairs. But those units probably cost me $285,000 when I consider the cost of the land and everything in it. These are all one bedrooms. At what point is there a return that's equitable to the landlord? Just like the people that work for a living want a fair wage. A fair wage is what's going to make the difference here. And the fact is, this is a community problem that you're trying to extract on the landlord. And I don't think that's fair. And I know that you haven't made any decisions yet. I'm just asking you to look at the big picture, and the people that are out there saying, let's look at the big picture. How can we solve this problem when we only have so much land in Monterey? There's only so many people that can live in Monterey. And we have limited resources of water, land. The construction materials have gone through the roof. As you know, plywood at one time went from $19 a sheet to $100 a sheet, and it's still up to about 45 or 50. That's almost double in construction costs. That money has to come from somewhere. So I just caution you guys to look at the big picture and step back and not look at a landlord as a person that you're going to vent all this anger on because the economy has been devalued. The fact is that the devaluation of the dollar has made everything more expensive. Taxation has caused that. And so, again, I ask that we all participate in the pain of helping people that can't help themselves, because that's what a society and a community does. But we don't extract it out of just one group of people. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vega. Next will be Scott Dick.
Good evening, everyone. I'm calling in from Chicago, Illinois, just to say hi. I won't repeat a lot of things that people have already said that are very important. I do want to say that what Nelson said about reducing the cost. Has anybody tried to get a painter or a contractor? I mean, we're talking about repair costs in a city where the median year the house was built was in 1970. And they're in the range of journeymen, not handymen. Journeymen are in the range of $100 an hour. So what Nelson said about not restricting contractors' prices at Home Depot makes repairing and keeping these units up to date very expensive. And I want to say, I had prepared remarks, and we sent a letter in to address some of these issues that we want to work with the city. We support renters. We think that housing availability is the number one issue. It's restricted by the lack of water. We just had one of the highest fees Monterey County history passed regarding our sewer rates. And so when it comes to that presentation, it was a strictly legalistic presentation. It was completely devoid of any kind of business aspect of providing rental units for people to live in. And I think we need to look at the business aspect of it, because what was not mentioned is the last statistic I saw about Berkeley's rent control program. It cost $1 million a year. Rental registries, costs are passed on to renters. And you can look at that as a tax on renting, not just making the landlords pay it. So I would just caution us all to sit down and talk. We have a lot of data. I provided some data in our letter, and we just want to make sure that people don't think it's not the greedy landlord, property owner, that's causing these high rates. Our property taxes never stop rising. Our homeowners insurance never stopped rising. The cost of goods and services never stopped. And so what you're saying is we're going to cap rents because we're going to stop our greedy homeowners. And I think that's just wrong. It's the wrong place. It really is, with 1492, a solution in search of a problem. Those protections last until 2025. There's AB 3088, which was not mentioned, which has really curtailed evictions. I know I'm in eviction court every Monday mediating. And by the way, the mediation program at the Mandel Business Center is free. It doesn't cost anybody on either side anything. So I would just suggest that you bring in MCAR. We can reach out to our experts. We can help provide quality data. And so we can all work together to get this problem solved. Thank you, City Council, for letting us speak. And we're available to discuss this anytime, any place, when I get back from Chicago. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Dick. I'm going to try again with Jeff Davy. I think we just had a muting issue. Mr. Davy, please go ahead. Mr. Davy?
Seems like his microphone isn't working. I suggest that Mr. Davi call in using a toll-free line.
I had received a comment that he that something had gone wrong with muting, but it seems like maybe it is a microphone. Next, let's try Brandon Naylor.
Mic check.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Thank you. My name's Brandon Naylor. I'm a landlord living in Monterey. I own a single family home and rent out 2 rooms. And my opinion varies greatly from the other landlords you've heard from. I think, you know, when one fellow talked about a 5% return, you know, a 5% return on $1 million property here is a whole different animal from a 5% return on a $200,000 property in the Midwest. I think one issue that hasn't really been addressed in terms of the supply and demand in housing on the peninsula is the diversification of supply. I've done some searching on Zillow and other websites regarding, you know, who all is renting out, and the majority of the properties are listed under 3 or 4 different property management companies. And when you have that few number of players controlling that much of the real estate, it's not really a free market economy anymore. You have an oligopoly. I think at least in the short term, one of the solutions we need to implement to at least alleviate some of these issues is to encourage more small people like myself to get into landlording. People who own single family homes who are capable of building on an ADU or have a spare room they can rent out. And I think to do that, we need to lower the barriers to entry, make resources available such as templates for legal documents and lease agreements, perhaps make city money available for loans for building ADUs, and streamline the water credits issues for protocols such as the second bathroom protocol. I think, you know, in the long term, we will need more housing, more affordable units built, but in the short term, it'll take little operations like these to get us going. Thank you. I yield my time.
Thank you, Mr. Naylor. Next, let's hear from Darlene Ruiz.
Hi, good afternoon. Mine's not so much a comment as it is a question, so I'm not sure if this is the appropriate time for it or not, but during the presentation, they were mentioning exemptions, right, for these certain regulations. And my question has to do with the exemption for a landlord that lives in the property, because I think that was listed on the exemptions along with single family homes, but I kind of lost track of what an exemption means. So I don't know if that's something that can be clarified or if that it's something for some other time.
Yeah, this is Hans, Mr. Mayor. I suggest we continue with the public comments and then maybe Karen can answer that question quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Great question. And what we normally do is, as questions come up from the public, we wait until the end of public comment, and then we'll have our staff and consultants answer the various questions that have been brought up. And your caring counsel also writes down those questions as well to make sure everything's been covered. So we will get an answer to the one concerning what does an exemption mean and home occupation of the owner. So let's go ahead and continue.
Our next speaker has called in on the phone, and the last 3 digits are 722. If you could please unmute by dialing *6. There you go. Please go ahead.
Hi. Hi. So my name is Laura Pratt, and I have a few questions regarding all of those, or comments.
Laura, you're
There's
fading
no
away.
doubt that the rents are way too high versus the wages that are paid. I'm sorry, what was that, Clementine?
We're having a hard time hearing you, Laura. I wonder if you could stay closer to the microphone.
Okay, I'm using my telephone, so I'm doing the best I can here.
Okay.
Unfortunately, that's part of the problem, is that I'm in a very old unit that's actually older than I am, and I'll be 58 soon. So the wiring's pretty bad, and I think that has a lot to do with my reception here. So as I mentioned, the wages are way too low that are paid to working families here. You know, we definitely are, a lot of us, the working poor. I know just myself personally, half my pay goes to rent. I did have a question from the consultant where she was talking about with the renters caps possibly, or the cap of renting. For instance, I get charged an extra $50 a month every month for an extra parking space for my disabled sister that lives with me. And I was wondering if that is factored into that annual rent increase that I also get on top of that. So that was one of the questions I had. We definitely have the situation where the rents go up by easily 5 to 10% at least every year, but the wages, if they go up at all, is maybe between 2 and 4% at best. I mean, I can tell you just even from a city employee standpoint that we would love 4% every year, but we don't get that. So these are the things that we really need to look at. And as the other commenter said earlier, there is definitely a problem with having too few people owning a lot of the units that would be subject to a possible rent control. I know, for instance, my landlord's company has multiple complexes, apartment complexes throughout Pacific Grove, Monterey, Seaside, and beyond. And they just pretty much raise it as much as they want to. And, you know, I know that the city started to do something about 6 months ago or so, but it was a voluntary basis. And people like my landlord don't go with that. Unless they have to, they won't.
Thank you, Laura.
All right, I know I'm out of time.
Thank
I
you.
hope you heard some of that. Thank you.
Thank you, we did. The next speaker is S. Kingsley. S. Kingsley.
I'm here.
Okay, go ahead, please.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Sasha Kingsley. I'm a local educator and Monterey native, born and raised. I grew up in Monterey in the 80s, and I'm currently raising my 2 children here on just my educator salary. I'm curious to know who on the city council is a renter in Monterey. Please feel free to chime in. Do we have any renters on city council? No? Okay. According to the 2019 US Census, over half of all Monterey residents are renters. Where is our representation, and who will go to bat for us at this council? City council members, respectfully, the majority of you are out of touch with what half of the people living in Monterey are experiencing. We are your educators, your nurses, your house cleaners, your nannies, servers, and drivers. We keep your children learning, put food on your table, and keep the tourism industry running. But why aren't we afforded the opportunity to live in the community that we serve? Why must so many low-income, middle-class, and now upper-middle-class workers commute from far away just in order to make rent? How much gas is wasted on that daily commute? And what is this doing to climate change? What does it say about the leaders in this town when renters are shut out from the community that we serve? City Council, I urge you to take the time and effort to invite renters to the table and listen to their stories of the last couple of years. How many have been displaced from the Monterey area when the area became flooded from Bay Area techies seeking a new workspace during COVID? How many landlords here profited off of that flood of Bay Area techies? How many had to pull their children away from their local schools and are now living far away from their workplace? Did you know that Colton Middle School, the only public middle school in Monterey, has closed due to low enrollment? How many renters are barely able to make rent each month or are going into debt, even if they're working multiple jobs? How many have wasted hundreds of dollars on rental applications that have led to no housing due to a tiny supply and a huge demand? We need more representation and our stories need to be heard. City Council, please take the time and energy to reach out and listen to your community, all of us. Thank you. I yield my time.
Thank you, Ms. Kingsley. The next speaker is Gabriela Chavez.
Hello, thank you. Yes, my name is Gabriela Chavez. I am a renter in Monterey County. I'm the city of Monterey. I was born here as well. I would like to address the council tonight to just urge you to continue to listen to your constituents, which, as we've stated more than once tonight, are more than 60% of the city. I want to re-emphasize that this rent control measures that you're looking into are not going to be targeting, the smaller landlords, the mom and pop landlords around the area, single family homes. It's not going to affect new construction, which was a concern raised by one of the landlords that spoke earlier. Again, this is, subject to the 1995 Act and the rolling statute of the 15-year buffer. So really what we're talking about is the larger landlords, which have been admittedly predatory in the city, mangled, like some of the earlier callers stated, there's not that many landlords in owning the majority of these units. And so we really are talking about a monopolized system that has come to a breaking point. It's not a one-stop shop measure, as stated. There's lots of prongs to come at this housing issue, but this is one of the measures that is going to help out a huge number of people, right, at the get-go of adopting something like this. And there's all kinds of more research and more information gathering to be done, I'm sure. I know this isn't a decision-making evening, but I just want to, continually urge this council to consider the majority of the renting voters in this city, and really, considering the motion that you've heard on the calls tonight. This is like a life and death matter for some people when you can't even afford your rent, versus a kind of annoyance, coming from not being able to pencil out each of your units as a larger landlord. So that's all I wanted to say for tonight, and thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chavez. Next, let's hear from Veronica Miramontes.
Good evening. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Perfect. My name is Veronica Miramontes, and I just want to say good evening to the mayor and the council. Thank you for your presentation tonight. It was very informative. I too support protections for tenants and rent control in the city of Monterey. I'm a renter for close to the past 10 years, and I graduate from CSUMB. And for my children, Monterey is their home. I work full time, as well as a Monterey representative for the Monterey Unified School Board. And my husband works full time. He also works at night in the restaurant industry. So we do juggle and hold a lot of hats and positions here in the city. And it's just very important for me to bring the voice, the majority of our Monterey population, which is the renters. Our dream really is to own a home and build that generational financial security for our family, just like many other homeowners that had this opportunity when homes were affordable. And I want to appreciate all the input that everyone had tonight and spoke about tonight. The suggestions for a living wage and rate increases, affordable housing, affordable home care and maintenance. I think those are our tools to address what the city is facing. But rent control is also one of those tools that we need to push the needle to an equitable community. As well as an empathy and care for our neighbors is something that's easily forgotten about. And that's really important for me to bring up as well. There are just so many people out here trying to live that American dream. While hospitality workers are a part of the community, they make our peninsula run. And the fact that so many workers have to commute to the city they serve versus being able to live here. We can have beautiful, beautiful units with Spanish style or whatever the majority is asking for as an opportunity too. I just hope that we can all continue this conversation and respect each other collectively and drive that needle on finding something that's going to really make the future of Monterey that is growing a way for us all to live and be able to thrive on this peninsula. And I'll yield the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Miramontes. Next, let's hear from Jason Asmus.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Perfect. So one of the things I really wanted to say today is, I was actually one of the few that was lucky and able to purchase an affordable property from the city of Monterey. And I can tell you what that's meant for me is that my daughter gets to be going to Monterey High, which I'm not sure if that had been the case otherwise. It has allowed me time and energy because, basically time is money. It's allowed me time and energy to go to school. I'm almost finished with my undergrad degree. It's allowed me the ability to switch careers and strive forward. And really, and ultimately, it allows me to have a foundation because I want to contribute back to this community. The other thing I really wanted to say too is after listening to everybody tonight, I don't think there's enough data on understanding the who, what, where, whens, and whys of all the properties. We don't know how many ADUs there are, how many mixed use, how many single families are being rented, how many apartments there are. So I don't know if maybe a rental registry or if there's a way to coordinate with the county to get that information. But I really feel it's incredibly important if you're going to be making decisions on any of this in any which way you choose to, that you have all the facts and all the data to understand exactly who and how you're impacting things. I think that's incredibly important. And, I'm still very, very gracious for what the city has given me. I hope to see that maybe on some of the land that they have acquired from Fort Ord, that we can look at some creative ways to build things out there, maybe think a little bit outside the box, sustainable ways to build things to give more people that opportunity. So generation after generation, they can still be here and, they can send their kids to Monterey High. I'm just really proud to see my daughter going there and I'm thankful she has the opportunity. And the city has given me that opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Asmus. Next, we have John Tilley.
Thank you very much. John Tilley from Monterey Commercial Property Owners Association. I want to thank the council for considering this important topic and along with the conversation today about water. I think that it's time for the water suppliers to supply water. That would be Monterey Peninsula Water Management District in particular, and also Monterey One Water, and to leave the planning to the citizens, the councils, and the planners within our jurisdictions, be it the local cities or be it the county as well. It's been proven that the supply of water here is a failing factor in providing housing. The debacle on Garden Road in particular proves that out. Even when it was just simply an idea of taking an existing property, turning it into an affordable housing project, it failed. And the reason for that is that we've entered into an agreement with the State Water Resources Control Board that needs to be honored. Acting as if somehow not living up to that agreement from our side is dependent or a failing of the State Water Resources Control Board fails to really notice that what's happened here is that the agreements we made with those folks to supply water has been left behind. There was a time when the water district and all the players in this area said that we are going to move toward a water supply project that would recognize the lots of records, that would allow for water to be available for city planners to use, for city councils to use to build out the supply that we need. When it was then later determined that for some reason that the desal plant wasn't necessary and that we should count on rainfall and we should count on recycled water solely, that really just really stuck a spoke in the wheels of the project and really water supply around here. So it's difficult to see that the water suppliers who are supposed to be giving us water need to be indemnified for doing so. That's not right. Time for, I think, time for our local leaders amongst ourselves to step up and demand that we have a water supply that allows us to provide for our citizens. And look at Highway 1 every day. Look at it in the morning, look at it in the evening, and tell me that we don't need a green project around here that has water on the peninsula. And let's, again, leave it to our city councils, our citizens, and our city planners to put together the kind of housing that we need here. Let's not any longer depend upon a failed water supply to do so. Thank you for allowing me to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Tilley. Next, we have Paula Pello, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes, thank you. So I earlier sent in an email to the members of the City Council on a United Nations Human Rights Council report called The Financialization of Housing. And I don't want to go through a long thing about that, but I'm hoping that people have had a chance to read it and that that's going to be available to the public, because what it points out is that governing bodies such as yourself have a responsibility to ensure that the human need for and right to adequate and secure housing is not impeded by private investments and investors. That doesn't mean they don't get a fair rate of return. It just means it's not impeded. It also asks that governing bodies redefine their relationship with private investors so that rather than treating housing as a commodity to be marketed and just surely profited from with no controls whatsoever on it, that the governing bodies reclaim housing as a social good and thereby ensure the human right to a place to live in security and dignity. So I thank you for undertaking this tonight. On the Central Coast and the Monterey Peninsula, we've witnessed an excessive increase in all housing costs in both ownership and in rentals. And for anybody living in the United States, they know that families build wealth by home ownership, but home ownership possibilities have just disappeared for most people, most working class people. And so that relegates most people, 60 to 66% of residents, as you've heard, to what has become a captive rental market where rents can be raised without any relationship to the cost of running and operating a rental housing market or a business. And so, not only have these rents skyrocketed, they're not being indexed to anything that has to do with increased costs or fair rate of return. I heard several speakers talk about that. And the fact is that Consumer Price Index takes into account those rising costs and maintenance and taxes and insurances. So rent control or rent stabilization ordinance do take that into account. The problem is there are many of these large companies that are benchmarking their excessive rental increases. And so that deepens inequality and increases the marginalization of those who are excluded. I want to very quickly say you have to have a rental registry. You can't analyze this and make any decisions without that data and that information. I want to ask a question of Karen Tiedemann very quickly. I thought I heard her say that vacancy control has been outlawed for mobile home rent stabilizations. I'm not sure if that's true. I think that there are some hybrids in that where you can have some vacancy control that limits the amount upon a vacancy and reset. So I'd like to have that question answered if possible. I have a lot more, but I will continue to send in my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pillow. Next, I would like to hear from the telephone caller whose number ends in 713. You could dial *6 to unmute yourself.
Yes, hello. This is Jeff Davy. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you for calling in.
Sorry about all the stress. Thank you so much for your help. I just called in and said the Zoom wasn't working. Anyway, I am a third-generation resident of the Monterey Peninsula, currently living in New Monterey. I wanted to just let everyone remember that we did do a little bit of work in the last 20 years voluntarily with city managers, and so Mr. Leonard remembers with voluntary guidelines in the past, in addition to some of the programs you currently have that included meetings with tenants and arbitrations and resolutions of disputes. And I think we've, as landlords, done as much as we can in that regard voluntarily. Of course, the AB 1482 now is the new law of the land. But there has been more than just the city programs that were talked about in terms of voluntarily. Also, this is really a supply and demand issue. And we didn't happen overnight, and it can't be cured with just one thing. What was happened in the last 40 years of our community, we haven't built the number of units we must need for the people that live here. And that is what's plaguing us today. It's just a lack of policies that allow for higher density, more housing, more affordable housing. I've got examples after examples. I personally tried to develop a project in Casa Verde. I was trying to get approval for multiple units, up to about 20 units. Zoning wouldn't allow it. The city required me to only build 9 houses. Those 9 houses were going to be resold for a lot more than 20 condominiums. That's going to drive the price of housing. Villa Rose on De La Vina in Monterey, I sold all those properties for a developer. That developer wanted to put more units there, but they weren't approved. They ended up building 15 houses. They sold a lot more than the 35 houses or condos he wanted to build. Garden Road. This is another example of, we just don't have the right policies in place to make the right decisions to provide housing that we need. Garden Road low income project, it's amazing that we pursue that in the face of a CDO from the State Water Resource Control Board asking for a break on the situation for special circumstances when we don't support the Monterey Water Supply Project. And that is a mixed message of policies that's really hurting our community. We need a water supply project. I am okay if this city wants to regulate how that water is used to the last ounce, but we need the project so we have the water to regulate. More importantly, if we had approved the water supply project, the low-cost Garden Road project would have been approved and would have had no problems. Unfortunately, it's not happening. The other point I want to make is there are some people who don't have a 401k. They use real estate as their retirement. And these are not big corporate entities. These are just people that were fishermen 30, 40, 50 years ago that bought an apartment complex, and that is what they have now for their retirement. I'm speaking of an example of one gentleman that had a house, could not get the house to go be sold because a tenant would not move out. He couldn't evict them, and he needed surgery. He's 75 years old. He was unable to get his surgery. He's been fighting to get the tenants out for over 12 months, and he was unable to do that. Now, I understand that's just one example, but that individual had no other source of income to help him out with his medical problems.
Okay.
And he was all over the news.
Mr. Davy, your time is up. Thank you for calling in. Next, we will hear from Morgan Ivins Duran.
Hello and thank you. I know we've had a lot of callers tonight. I'm sure there are more after me, so I will try to keep my comments brief. I have lived in Monterey for 5.5 years, and 3.5 of those years were as a renter. And I certainly have many friends and colleagues who do still rent here and would be impacted by any decisions taken by the council on this issue. And certainly instability in the rental market has broader impacts on our collective quality of life here in the city of Monterey, whether we are renters or homeowners. I really appreciated the staff report as well as the presentation at the start of this agenda item. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone here tonight that we have a lack of housing in the city of Monterey that is affordable for middle and even upper middle income individuals and families. This is a complex issue and it will require a multi-pronged solution, which also addresses our water shortages, which several callers have mentioned tonight. I know that this is a study session and there's a lot more investigation, analysis, and public discourse that will happen before any decisions are made by the council. So I will close by emphasizing the importance of this discussion, and I am looking forward to additional conversations over the coming months. And with that, I cede the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Next speaker will be Hector Azpilicueta, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Correct, you're pronouncing it right.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor, City Councils. I thank you very much for tonight's presentation. This is definitely a very difficult subject, and it's very, very important for people in the peninsula. My name is Hector Azpilicueta, and I do represent the Hotel Works and Restaurant Works Union in the Monterey County. One of the issues that we had prior to the pandemic was obviously the housing situation for many hotel and restaurant workers in the peninsula. The pandemic has made it worse for many, many people, and hospitality workers are not the exception. But one of the things that we know it is our members live basically in cities outside the city of Monterey. And the reason is because they don't make enough money to afford to live in the Monterey County or in the Monterey City, excuse me. We know that there are many workers who travel from Monterey to Salinas or from Castroville or Watsonville just to work in this peninsula. But they are not able to live in this peninsula. And so what we would like to see it is the city of Monterey taking the leadership in this area and make sure that the people that is the backbone of the hospitality industry are taking care of them in whatever way you can, especially with some sort of rent control, so people can live and work in the Monterey County. Thank you very much and have a good night.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Joanna Down.
Good evening, and thank you for calling on me. I think that there have been a lot of eloquent speakers, very studied on the subject, and so I'm not going to repeat any of that. Just to say that I've been a renter my entire life, and I am now in my 70s, and coming to the understanding and the crude reality that not only was I not able to purchase a home, but that as a renter, I am slowly being moved away from my chosen places to live. And that is my choice. And I've chosen to live in places that are extremely expensive to live in. And that is my choice. So I think that are issues here on all sides of this question. The only thing I want to add here is the first resolution that was discussed at this meeting had to do with the military contracts. And I think for the purpose of the housing discussion, I think it needs to be addressed in any discussion on this as well. I've been priced out of several places because the landlords were holding out for a military contracted person to be coming in that pay more rent. And there was just nothing that anyone could do about that. I'm very grateful at the moment to be living in a unit with a really admirable landlord who is conscious of the rental issues in this area. And I'm currently living in a small 1-bedroom, but that it is under market rate value. And that's the only way that I've been able to live here. So I, just think that this is a really important issue. I acknowledge the council and everyone who's attending and all of the committee meetings that have been happening, to put this at the forefront. And it is a complex and complicated issue. There's also the issue of the students. I mean, it looks at all the varying economic factors in our community, from students to military to healthcare workers to tourism to hotel workers to your senior citizens, families. It touches every single person here, whether you're a renter or a homeowner or a landlord. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have one more speaker, Gabriella James. If there's anyone else who plans to speak, please use the raise your hand feature, or you can dial *9 if you're called in by phone. So Gabriella James.
There. Great, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I think it is a really important issue for renters in the Monterey Peninsula, especially because there's so much diversity in terms of who can rent and who can own, and the divide is super big. Myself, I moved to the community in 2010 to go to CSUMB, and since then I've kind of lived in every kind of area there has been. I've lived in Marina and Seaside and Monterey finally. And Monterey is obviously my preferred area of residence. And I acknowledge that I moved into my current apartment about 3 years ago, and know that if I was to move out, our landlord would probably renovate it, and this apartment would be essentially unaffordable. So knowing that, even like and a little bit ago, I was looking for apartments for a 1-bedroom and for myself to live in, and it's completely unaffordable. So knowing that, what we have been giving at this point is really advantageous to us as residents, but it's also, there's kind of like the bottom line where, if you have to move out and you have to kind of, start over, that the rental wages are severely unaffordable. That said, there are a lot of landlords who are working in our behalf to, ensure that we do have a safe place to live and a happy place to live. So I guess kind of in that vein, it's been really interesting seeing the route that rentals have taken, especially over the last, 10 or so years, where, at one point I've lived in a house with 7 or 8 folks and was still paying, $600 for a room, for a private room. And that's a small, tiny house in Seaside with 8 other residents, 7 or 8 other residents. So just knowing that those are the options out there, and being able to find what you have been able to find, I'm super grateful for that, but also very, very worried that if I was to take the next step and try to move into a place where I didn't need a roommate or to afford, the cost of living, that it would be a completely different situation. So, thank you again for having me and listening to what I have to say. And I hope that, that Monterey continues to be a place where we can house folks that really provide the backbone of the economy, and whether that means the hospitality industry or the agricultural industry. We've got a diverse group of people here that all need to survive, and it takes us all working together to do so. So thank you again.
Thank you for your comment. And next we have Mike Rodriguez.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. So thank you guys for having me here. I just wanted to kind of give another voice to renters in the community. I'm a renter, and I think it's really important that there is some sort of stabilization done for renters who have been here in the community. Like we've helped build the community, we've helped pay taxes, we've helped create what we've seen as our city and our county and community. And I think that there is an important side of investing in those people who have built that, and not kind of outsourcing our workforce from other cities or things like that. I don't think that necessarily landlords should take the brunt of that either. I don't think anyone's against them getting their proper percentage, in earnings and profit margins. But when you have 5 to 10% increases every year, and housing is a long-term investment, then you're looking at huge amounts over those initial percentages. So I don't think the limits and stabilization efforts that we're putting towards it are necessarily going to hurt profits as much as, they are going to hurt profits, but it's not going to put anyone in the negative or, affect it to that level that it's being kind of portrayed to be. I think we can still keep landowners making a profit without gouging on a yearly basis, especially if a lot of those increases aren't necessary, or if that unit didn't even need necessarily a lot of maintenance or things to happen throughout the year. I feel like I've been increasing my earnings on a regular basis, but with everything increasing, and that of course is including inflation on other things, it always seems like I'm still living check to check regardless. So I feel like any kind of effort the city can make to assist with that, and even investing back to not put all that onto the landlords so that they stay here and create nice environments here as well, would be helpful, so that the city can do things like that. I also wanted to bring up a question regarding applications for renters. There is a huge demand. So sometimes we get cases where there's, 40 plus 50 applications, and they are starting to make a profit off of this. Is there a way we can limit the amount of applications someone can take and make them process those before they can accept more, so it doesn't turn into them just holding out to kind of just make a bunch of application fee cash that they don't actually plan to process? But yeah, I just wanted to put that out there, that I think it's important to maintain the backbone and the workers of our communities and keep people here. And I hope you guys found some use out of my comments. And that's it.
Thank you. Next, we have a phone caller with the last digits of 018. Please dial *6 to unmute yourself. 018, please dial *6. Please go ahead.
Hello?
Hi, we can hear you.
Hi. My name is Lori Hambaro, and I'm a very long-term resident of Monterey. And I'm fortunate to have some rental income that I use for my retirement. A couple of questions or concerns is that the wages here in Monterey do seem to be rather low, and do seem to be somewhat based on tourism. And I'm just wondering if perhaps the tourist businesses could contribute to some sort of rental fund that could be administered by the city and, kind of help this affordability out. Also, I think that there does need to be a registry created so that we do know what we have as inventory, what the rents are existing. And also, I get concerned about the habitability of the older units. And of course, landlords need to repair those older units, but in some cases they don't. I think there was a lady who mentioned an apartment that didn't even have proper wiring. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.
Thank you, Lori. And I see only one more commenter. It's Esther Malkin. Please go ahead, Esther.
Good evening, everybody. I am sure that the council and staff are very happy to hear from other people besides me on the renter plight, since I began advocating and created my group Monterey County Renters United a couple of years ago, which has been basically the representing voice for the people who can't come out for fear of retaliation or being blackballed by these property management companies that share information, and they are very organized, and so people cannot afford to take a chance of not being able to find a place to live by coming out and speaking. So I have done that for the last couple of years, and I'm glad to see more are joining in. That said, I want to make it clear that I know what it's like to be a landlord because I have been a landlord and I have owned homes in other states in the past. And I have lived here 20 years. So I am not a newcomer like some people have tried to make me out to be. So here we are finally talking about the dreaded word rent control. But the question here really is, who controls what? Because we have a select number of property management companies that, while the term property management sounds benign and like they're helping a bunch of mom and pops be the ones to manage their properties who need those incomes, they are controlling our market rate. How are they doing that? Because they have the ability to change the rate every time a unit turns around and vacates. And when that person that's been vacated is starting to look for another place to live, they are looking at an inventory of rates that have all been raised. Now, all of you that are not renters on this call are sitting home in the comfort of your homes without the threat of you getting a notice in the mail that you are going to have your rent increased when you have not had your income increased anywhere near the level that this has happened. I would like to point out that 4 out of our 5 council members are property rental, own properties that they rent. Not all are equal. If you own 1 or 2 units, it's not the same as if you own 40 or 50. But as far as that goes, the property management companies combined have the opportunity to manipulate the market rate, just like the airlines do. And we all, were shocked when they started charging for luggage, and middle seats were the only way you could go without paying extra. And now it's commonplace. We are in the same situation. We are traumatizing the majority of the residents in this city who are organizing. And I would like to remind you that every renter has a vote, just like every property management company and every homeowner has 1 vote. And as the majority, if people want to have their cases heard, we need to elect people that are going to be held accountable to the vote.
Thank you, Esther. And Mayor Roberson, I do not see any further commenters.
Okay, thank you. As one commenter said, there was certainly a very articulate, informative group of people who shared their good thoughts with us. And we've been here for 2.5 hours. We absolutely need to take a break. When we get back, we will get some of the questions that were presented answered by our consultants and staff. Then the council at that point can decide how long we want to discuss this or take this under advisement. Where do we go from here? Because we'll be pushing 10 o'clock, I think, by the time we even finish answering the questions. So we will see everybody in 12 minutes at 9:40. Again, thanks for all of that great public comment. Please, as much as you can get to us in writing, we would appreciate it. And here we are back with a lot to digest. Again, extraordinarily intelligent public comment, as always. Hans, I'm going to ask your team to address some of the questions that were brought up, and I'm sure they've kept track. And I asked one that I found the answer to myself, which was in our incredible staff report, and I'll share that a little bit later. So if you will, please.
Yes.
No, you're muted right now.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
There you go. Very good. Thank you.
It's the microphone in the council chamber, not the Zoom mute.
Yes.
I would ask Karen Tiedemann to please address those questions briefly that were asked of us. I think the first question was the exemption of people living on a property, if they are renting that out, are they exempt from rent control? And I think the other question that I tracked was a question about vacancy and mobile homes, if you can answer those two questions.
Sure. So let me start with the vacancy and mobile homes. I'm sorry, my cat seems to want to get in the camera here.
Hey, don't make me get my dog.
It won't have any impact, trust me. So with regard to vacancy control and mobile homes, I should have been clear that what we've mainly been talking about is rent control for non-mobile homes. And mobile homes are slightly different. Mobile homes are not subject to the Costa-Hawkins Act. So you can have vacancy control for mobile homes. So, sorry. Yeah, a little distracting here. Okay, and then the other question I think was what, I think the question was, what does occupancy mean?
The question was if someone lived in the rentals as the owner lived in the rental property, did that exempt it? I think was the question. Is that the way you heard it?
Yeah. So if when the owner is living in it, it is exempt. But that does not always mean that the owner, if the owner moves out, it may be subject to rent control at that point, depending on what type of property it is.
In that case, let's say someone has 10 units and the owner lives in one of them, so everything's exempt?
No. So under the state rent cap, the only thing that's exempt is if it's a duplex and the owner lives in one of those duplexes and lived in it at the beginning of the tenancy and lives in it for the duration of the tenancy. So in your example of a 10-unit property, if the owner lives in it, the other 9 units would be covered. Got it.
And someone asked about $50 for a handicap parking place, I think.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. So as I understood that question, it was, does the state rent cap apply when you take that percentage of increase? Do you apply it to everything, including things like the parking space? And, I, during the break, was looking at the statute. The statute, frankly, is just not clear on that issue. I would say that you do, that all of that is part of your bundle of goods that you are renting. But I don't think that we have any clarity. And there isn't a definition of rent in the state rent cap legislation. So that may be something that we get further interpretation on as that law is implemented for a longer period of time.
Right. And someone asked about limiting the number of applications. He said 30, 40 applications, and everyone pays a fee to the potential landlord, right?
Right. I mean, I have not seen any jurisdiction do that. I think that there's sort of a trade-off there. You don't want to foreclose people's opportunities to apply. But if property owners are doing it solely to collect the fee, I mean, the fee is supposed to be related to a cost. So if they're just collecting the fee, there might be something to regulate there.
Yes. Were there other questions that you heard, Karen, or any of the council or staff heard?
Those are what I noted.
Yes. Okay, one of the questions I had asked, and it was in the staff report after I had a chance to do some more research at the break, and about 88% of the city's housing stock was constructed before 1990. And so I was asking how many, so we'd have to take the number of housing units, but then again, the housing units, if they're multiple units, so we could go from there. 62% of multifamily housing has 5 or more units. 50% of the city housing units are multifamily, which would indicate that there are, that means 50% are not, I guess, is that what it means? That they're single family dwellings, but they're also being rented, obviously, in order to get that high. So 50% of the city's housing units are multifamily. So I think that's on staff report packet page 10. So I think it doesn't have to be done tonight, but I'm sure those statistics that I'm looking on page 10 would probably help us figure out how many units would be potentially subject to a rent control ordinance. So I share that. Okay. Council, did you hear any other questions, or Councilmember Dan?
I have a question to staff, Clyde. And it deals with each property over 4 units apply for a business license in our city. And I think that's what the city manager told me, I believe. And my question to that is that per property, or is it per business? So if one person owns multiple properties but has a business, do they have to apply for a license for each one of those properties?
So Councilmember Dan, you're right. The city manager told you 4, and then was afterwards corrected that these are 10 units. And then I believe I shared this.
I might have heard it wrong.
No. Yeah, yes. Thank you for trying to bail me out, but I actually told you it was 4, but it's actually 10. And I believe this applies to the total number that you have in per property, then that you have to pull and register a business license per property if you have more than 10 units.
So if we do have a business license and we do have registered properties, isn't there any way that we could use the business license to add a few questions about how many units there are, what units are going for, or whatever? What I'm saying is we already have something in place, and that's the business license registration. And I'm just wondering if that could be used.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you don't have to answer now.
It's something
I'm just bringing that out.
Yeah.
That's just a comment more than anything else.
Absolutely.
Mayor?
Yes, please go.
Yeah,
while
we're on page 10, I actually drilled down on that as well, and I think you addressed it in terms of the numbers and trying to figure out what these numbers mean. Couple factors that is going through my mind. Some of this data is 2019, so maybe it's dated, but it's coming from the report that's in the staff report, Vulnerable Communities Needs Analysis and the Regional Analysis of Impediments to Fair Housing Choice. I've got to admit, I haven't read those reports, but then it throws some data in here that's very helpful, but it still leads the question on the heels of the census that we don't yet have all of the data. Also, one standout figure in here, of the 65.9% of housing units occupied by renters, 35% are occupied by low or moderate income households. Let me say it again, 65% of housing units and 35% are tenants that are in the low and moderate income households. So I'm wondering if we compared ourselves to other cities of our size and our demographics, where does that 35% figure compare to other cities? Because it seems as though that means that the people that own the housing stock and rent to 65.9% are in some way contributing to some form of either Section 8, inclusionary housing, reduced rents. So they're participating in trying to help. But it would be interesting to, gather more legs around that data in what it means. But it just seems like that's a high number. And I'm wondering if staff has any comment. Is there any way to compare that to other cities?
Yes, that can be done. The regional analysis of impediments and vulnerable community strategy, those deal with Monterey County and how Monterey fits into the county. So for us to find other like cities that are more closer comparisons to us, it's just a matter of searching that data and finding comparable reports that were generated by those cities and those counties. So it's definitely something we can do. But those numbers that we reference are specific to work that we did here in this county.
Yeah. So that's, there's not much else I can say about the data, but I think that's the central issue of many of the callers were saying, look more at the data, gather more data. But I'm struggling with the testimony we heard tonight from a variety of folks. And the central issue is, well, what do we do with this data and information tonight, and what's the potential group that we're trying to help? And that goes back to the data. I think the mayor was identifying, well, if we're trying to apply some solution, and let's say it's a stabilization of rent and some policies, then what are the numbers that we're trying to help, and what's the potential choices there? And so I'm just struck by many of the callers that we're talking about, what they're doing now with their tenants, and as well as the state regulations of the 5% cap plus CPI. It's only a year and a half old, maybe 2 years old. So we do have regulations already in place. And I think the central issue really is supply and demand. And as many of the callers talked about, was getting more housing units that's tied to how do we get more water so that those housing projects can move ahead. So I don't have any clear direction. I'm just saying I'm always looking for more data.
Thank you. Other council members? Councilmember Allen?
Yeah, I have some comments. I'm not sure if you still are looking for questions or comments.
No, this is comment time, comments, and where do we go from here?
Okay, so for me, first of all, to everyone who called in, I want you to know that this entire council hears you, we care about you, we represent everyone in this city, regardless of your status. And I personally, I've been a renter most of my life. I'm an owner now, but I've been a renter most of my life. I'm guessing that's true of most of my colleagues. So we do understand how everyone involved in these relationships, what your situations are. Where I'm at right now is I think we have information that we don't have that we need. We heard some claims that there are a few big companies that effectively monopolize the market. I don't know if that's true. It could be true, but I don't know if that's true. If it is true, then that would sort of certainly change my thinking a little bit. And so I think we really do, at a minimum, need to get that information. And I think a rental registry is the best way to do that. That's not rent control. That's about getting the information of who owns what kind of properties, how many units, how many people are living in those units, what are they charging for those units. I think we really need that information. I don't think we're going to get it any other way. So secondly, I think the rental registry would generate some revenue that we could use to create programs that would help resolve issues short of, some sort of draconian rent control. Things like a mediation board, I think that makes a lot of sense. Things like enforcing and regulating tenant protections so that we don't have landlords forcing people out, evicting people under the guise of, let's say, renovating, and yet they're not even really renovating. They just want to force somebody out so they can bring someone else in and jack the rent up. That's not right. But we don't even know if that's happening. But we would know if that was happening if we had a rental registry and if we had somebody whose job it was to sort of regulate that. So tenant protections, including, eviction sort of standards to make sure. And I thought one idea that our consultant mentioned that really resonated with me was, if you're going to claim that you have to evict somebody to renovate and you don't even have a permit, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. And so again, I think the rental registry could raise some money that would pay staff who would be doing the work to make sure that if somebody's being evicted, allegedly for a renovation, that there's actually a renovation happening. And it isn't really a forced eviction just so somebody can raise the rent and bring in somebody from Silicon Valley who can afford to pay more. I think we have a public interest in making sure that the people who work here can afford to live here. And I think we all share that interest. I don't think we want to become a community that is really exclusively out of area retirees and sort of people who are working here or working somewhere else but living here. I don't think that's the kind of, that to me doesn't sound like a community. That doesn't sound like what Monterey's historically been as a community. So we've got some 60% of the people who are renting. We heard from quite a few of them, and bear in mind that a lot of them probably feel a lot of anxiety about even speaking to us at all because of the power inequality and the fact that maybe they get evicted if they speak. So I just think that a good first step would be a rental registry so we get more information on what our rental market actually is, how many people are in different types of units, what their rent is, how many people are living in them. I think I want to protect families. I think I heard something about that maybe there could be special eviction protections for tenants where there are children. I want to make sure that people aren't being evicted unnecessarily. And I don't know. Those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Always well said. Councilmember Dan?
Yeah, if I can follow up on what Alan is talking about, especially the rental registry. And I hate to keep bringing this up, but I don't like staff doing any duplicate work. And so if we do yearly collect business license, I keep bringing it up, but it just seems to me there's a connection there. Because if they're paying for business license, as Alan mentioned, they would be doing the same thing as a rental registry. So that would be double their cost, I guess. So for me, just by adding additional questions to that business license would give us the information that we need to find out exactly what's going on in our community, unless the rental registry is for accountability purposes, to find out whether our renters are not protected. Then I could understand that's a different course going in the rental registry. And I want to mention, like Alan did, thank you for all the callers that did call in. And as Alan mentioned, that we represent everybody in this community, and we hope that this is a tough conversation. It really is, especially, and very complex to solve. But we're all talking, and that's the most important thing. And the city needs to talk about it together and not apart. It can't be an us against them. And that's one thing that I really want to stress tonight. We have to work through this problem together.
Yes, and the whole idea of rental registry, I'd be really interested in having a deeper conversation about that. I'm just wondering how they work. Do you list people's names? How personal is it? Is it statistical? I'd love to see some models. Maybe Karen and our staff can help and see how some of those models work. And then rather than design it tonight, let's see how other people do it and what the cost would be. Because I'd really be very interested in looking at that.
So Mayor, can I ask the question of staff, just on a thumbnail number, how many apartment units do we think we would be asking to have to do a registry? So that would be a duplex all the way up to, a 40 unit or 100 unit apartment. So the enormity of a registry for keeping some sense of whether it's occupied, what the rent charged is, who the owner is, some type of maintenance inspection when there's a move out. I'm struck with what we went through in the budget, and our city manager asked us and said no new programs because everything's associated to a cost. But I also want to pass on what we heard tonight from some of the professional folks in the business, that everything that is a cost to the unit gets passed through because it's a business that is occupying some return, and maybe it's marginal, maybe it's not much, maybe they've owned it a long time, maybe they're investments. But anything that we act in a policy that is put onto the property owner for anything, like the sewage that occurred to all of us, the water rates going up, PG&E going up, that all gets passed on to the tenants. So we have to be very careful with any policy we're talking about that would adversely impact the tenants that were calling us tonight, that are saying they're already up against the line where they're making choices of, whether they can stay or whether they can make their rents. I want to return to some comments from some of the good callers that they made great points and they were very articulate. And I think we had well over 20. So this is one of those issues that's obviously resonating in the community. Two things I wanted to talk about. The list of action items that this council and staff have done over the last couple of years related to housing is very significant. So I would encourage everyone that's looked at the staff report, make sure you go through that list, because there's substantial efforts that we've had. What's not on that list is the fact that we don't allow short-term rentals. That's a huge thing that many cities have not been able to put a stop to, but we have held to that. So the fact that we don't allow short-term rentals means that we are trying to maximize the housing stock we have. And we stand behind that as a council. The other thing is, I spent the day in a Northern California mountain community, and they announced that they've been able to build 193 units this last year. 193. Water is not a problem for them. They have snow, they have lakes, and they're looking at doing more next year. That's really at the central point of what we're talking about here. That's the stumbling block for us to see the available lots of record and the projects to move forward. So the callers did a good job of identifying where we need to be. You've all heard me say that before, and supporting an alternative water supply and long-term sustainable desal plant, in my mind, is what's going to free up and get us the inventory of water so that we're able to have infill and move ahead with projects.
All right, Tyler, what are you thinking? Councilmember Tyler.
Okay, so I appreciate the city taking on this conversation and hope that this is just the beginning, as has been indicated a couple times throughout this conversation. As we navigate the discussion with our community members and employees throughout the city, I'll reference, and pardon me for this might be sounding a little bit hokey, but I'm speaking more specifically to our residents here, particularly our renters. So I just want to provide a little bit of inspiration because this is really difficult for them. And I'm really appreciative of the ones that were brave enough to come out and speak tonight. So referencing one of my mentors, President Obama, and I'll do it a couple of times here. So, but I'll start off with his idea of the power of place, the need to anchor our efforts to build a better world, not in theories and abstractions, but in neighborhoods and communities. I'd ask to think about what efforts are we doing to think about the 65% of Monterey residents who are renters, many who I hear from, but that ask me not to say anything publicly in fear of retaliation. And I've heard several times that there's these laws that are established that protect renters from retaliation, but it doesn't get rid of that fear. So how are we working towards creating a better space for them to want to speak up, to create better protections for them? Because obviously the laws as they are now are not enough. This is unacceptable, and we can't sit here and say there is nothing we can do. Obama often speaks about the common bonds and the needs for us to work together to solve some of our toughest challenges, kind of echoing Dan's point earlier. Well, I think the impacts on renters, particularly those who are paid low wages, is one of them. It's easy for many of us who are more fortunate to focus on our own personal wants and needs, not realizing that we're only as strong as our weakest link. And then we wonder why we have an increasing homelessness problem requiring already vulnerable community members to depend on a landlord to take them in. And when they can't afford that, it's off to a car or a tent. But change is hard. And Obama also notes that change doesn't happen on a global scale. It starts one person at a time, one neighborhood at a time, one community at a time. Ordinary people working together can do extraordinary things. Going further, policy changes are only going to happen if some of you in our community step up to make it happen. Again, my hope is that today is just the beginning of the conversation, and we'll need a few willing community members to help organize and gain additional support as we try and make change happen. Keep the city and council honest as to what our jobs are and how we can reimagine our communities. One of the issues I continue to hear is how much water is a barrier to our housing problems. We need to think about solutions that we can focus on while we're waiting for the water, and attention on renter protections seems to be a worthy conversation to have now. And I just want us to be careful not to continue to try to point to like other things as problems. The cost of housing, water, when we're trying to have a conversation about something that may be somewhat related, but not connected. So I think it's helpful to bring focus to the conversation. Community is okay generally, and I've heard this over and over again when I was campaigning in 2018 with more units. People are okay with us putting more housing stock within the city of Monterey, as long as they're affordable, right? They want to provide housing for those that live and work in our communities. So housing development is definitely part of this conversation. But again, we're talking about this other side of the conversation here. Unfortunately, our inclusionary housing requirement is 20%, not nearly enough. And for those that aren't familiar with the inclusionary housing requirement, it basically says that any development that has 6 or more units is required to have 20% of those be affordable. Well, again, when you get back to that point I was just making about community members being okay with it, just making 20% of the units affordable isn't enough. and it doesn't meet the needs of the most vulnerable in our community. We don't need more market rate, we need more affordable. This is not a short-term issue that's easy to get this many folks to turn out. So, you know, it's oftentimes very easy to get folks to turn out to a city council or public meeting when there's something that we can implement right away and there's a quick reward. Well, the challenge around this conversation with housing is that we're talking about 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road when something is going to change. So despite this conversation around renters and feeling vulnerable around coming out and speaking publicly, there's this other thing where it's like, even if you all implement something, how is that going to affect me today? Our voluntary rental guidelines, I feel haven't been fruitful, and it would be interesting if we could somehow see data on that, though I'm not sure if that's possible. And now they're out of compliance with state law since January 2019 when AB 1482 went into effect. We need to support the repeal of Costa-Hawkins. And then speaking specifically to landlords, I think that there is space for us to have a conversation here around how do we protect those, particularly the ones that are the mom and pop shops, because I have heard from those folks as well. And Brandon said that he was one of the speakers today, and he said that I could share this. And I just kind of want to read a message that he had sent me today, because he brings up a lot of good points that I think are relevant for us to think about and consider. So this could be anything from setting up a website of resources, and then he gives some example lease agreements, legal forms, references for contractors, etc., offering loans to build ADUs, which is another conversation we need to have, or renovate rooms, setting up a local landlord listings page, like a less sketchy Craigslist for independent landlords, or setting up a community pool of money or insurance policy to cover large unexpected expenses related to being a small landlord. And he goes on, but I'll stop there and just kind of reiterate that I think there is space for us here to have conversation about policy or programs that we can implement simply by adding more information to our website. But that being said, I think it's important for us to think about the context of the conversation. Leasing or renting a property is a risky investment. You are coming from a position of power over somebody else who likely has less wealth than the tenant you are renting to. So I think it's just really important for us to keep that in mind as we're trying to talk about developing policy here. This entire council is made up of homeowners. And so though some of us may have been renters in the past, it's important for us to recognize our place of privilege in 2021 when in an environment where it's a lot different than when any of us may have been renters in the past. So I think it's just really important for us to keep in mind that we are representing a huge portion of our community that we can't relate to given the current environment, particularly with the effects of the pandemic and how that's made it worse since an already worsening condition since any of us had been renters. So I'm going to kind of ask two questions here and then try to wrap up. So I think for me, the most important thing, because it seems like there's some support of moving forward on something, but I would just ask that part of this conversation as we're closing it out is, what does the timeline look like as far as bringing this back in front of the council? I don't want this to be something that kind of just goes out there and dies. And then I'm trying to fight something in the background with staff and we're not being held accountable with the public. I think we need to kind of be realistic and talk to staff during a public session and kind of commit to a time frame as far as when it's reasonable for us to follow up on next steps and what that looks like. So that's kind of one question I just want to pose out there. And then another question for staff is, do we know how many rentals are owned by mom and pops versus companies? Then my bottom line, we need protections, right? We're looking at the demand side of the supply and demand equation. We need protections for our renters that make up the greatest part of our population in the city. and we need production and the supply side. And I think that the city council and the city staff have made some efforts in moving in the production side, and there's still a lot of work to do there, but we need to figure out the protections. And to me, that's a more short-term fix, and hopefully it can address some of the housing woes that we're experiencing in the community. I really want to give a lot of appreciation for the folks that came and spoke today, particularly the renters, because it is a place of vulnerability. We heard somebody crying today. I hope that that creates a little bit of inspiration to make other people feel comfortable and come out and share your stories and let us know what's going on, because that's the only way we're going to be able to make true effective policy changes as we move forward here. So I agree with Alan's comments in regards to the rental registry. I think that's a good place for us to like hit the go now. I think that's a no-brainer. I don't think we need much more to determine whether we need to do that. And I think all these other things that we're talking about, I think that deserves a whole other conversation for us to continue on. So I can talk all night, but I'm gonna stop there. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks. As you pointed out, it's a very complex issue. There's the whole idea of wages. How do wages keep up with housing? For example, I'm an elementary school teacher, and I was able to buy a little house on an elementary school teacher's salary. Well, obviously, the cost of housing vastly accelerated beyond the ability today. And 3 of our children are elementary school teachers. They're dealing every day, and they work in disadvantaged schools, and they're dealing every day with a population that is struggling. We have grandkids who are also looking at rental markets in the colleges where they're going, one of which is in San Francisco. And you've got 5, 6 young people jammed into a 2-bedroom apartment, and that's $4,000 or $5,000. And so I think all of us have personal experiences of how difficult this is out there. And during my 35-year career in New Monterey, which is a large area of a rental population, I was dealing with parents and not getting obviously into their financial woes, but just understanding where they were coming from. And I know all of us on the council have that same experience personally through our work, and also just vicariously. So there certainly is a care and a concern and an experience that we get it. And so I'm thinking that we're pushing 3.5 hours. Time flies when you're having fun. So let's let staff kind of chew on this rather than come out with a timetable tonight. I don't think that would be fair. I personally would like, maybe the next step would be, I'd like to look at the pros and cons of rental registries, how they work, how you pay for them. Dan's idea, can we do it simply? I think that would be a great beginning. It would give us some of the data that all of us want to have. So I would suggest that would be a really good first step. And we can ask our staff, after they've had a chance to hear everything that they've seen, to think about maybe the step after that. So we'll, if that sounds good, that's where I think would be our next step.
Yeah, Mayor,
could I just offer, because I think a time frame is helpful and important for us to have that conversation with staff. I mean, are we talking about a year? Are we talking about 2 years? And there's precedent here. That's why I'm asking. And it's not to throw shade or to be disrespectful to anybody. I just think it's important that we're transparent with the public in regards to a realistic time frame that we can talk about. And maybe we get it done before then, but let's just put something out there so that we have something that we can be held accountable to.
I don't mind that, Councilmember Tyler. I'm just thinking, with all of the information we received tonight, the more information that we've asked for, and also I think the input we're going to continue to get from the public, I think to ask the staff tonight to give us a ballpark figure, I don't think is fair, but if maybe a month from now, 2 months from now, they could say, hey, this is where we think this work program would take us. That's all I'm saying.
So I think that's fair, Mayor. If that's maybe a compromise, is to say that staff comes back to us in 2 months and gives us a time frame, and that way again, we're having that conversation with the public so that they can hold us accountable.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And the time frame may be to consider some of the things that have been put on the table tonight versus to make them happen. For example, one speaker said whether we go rent stabilization or not. He said 3 important things were making sure places were habitable. That was brought up tonight. People are free of retaliation. And thirdly, eviction protection. Those were 3 issues that someone very articulately pointed out to us. And so, yeah, there was a lot put on the table tonight that I really am interested in investigating.
So Tyler, are we talking about the 1st of December? That's 2 months. Is that what you're looking at?
That sounds reasonable. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, it's not staff reports, et cetera. It would be
just an update.
Sorry? Yeah, an update on realistically when can we deal with these, and don't forget, we balanced our budget this year with $6.2 million of federal money that we're not going to have.
Right.
And don't forget, we laid off 100 people during the pandemic.
Yes.
So I'm not saying that's an excuse for not doing something, but that scares me.
And we did make a commitment in terms of the process to be very careful in terms of our work plans and our creating new initiatives that are time sensitive and as well as labor intensive. I want to just point to what Dan was talking about, and I think there's an opportunity. I think our staff really pretty much knows what units are out there through zoning, collections of addresses, geo files, applications. I mean, I just am very uncomfortable aligning myself with a rental registry to solve what is simply a data gathering exercise. I would be interested in hearing from the staff in a couple of months in terms of what is our capacity to gather the data that we may need. And we had some very valuable questions tonight that's contained in the staff report. I think that's just a good place to start. What do we have under the roof now that we would then be able to turn into some data for considerations? But I think jumping to a rental registry and additional staff and a fee structure and on and on and on, and starting a new initiative, I'm just not there yet. And frankly, I've got to be got to see an identified return that we're after, if that's the only way to get it. But I think there's other ways to do it rather than just a rental registry and running program and starting major initiatives and talking about having to hire additional staff. So I'd like to see some answers to some of the questions here in the next couple of months and see what our capacity is for doing the data gathering on what our inventory is now.
Councilmember Allen, thank you. Councilmember Ed.
I guess I've got to be honest, I've never heard of a business license for landlords. Tonight in the discussion was the first I've heard of it. It wasn't part of the staff presentation. So I think I need to hear more about how that actually works. What do they pay? And if they are paying, then that should be a source of revenue to fund the kind of work we're talking about. That would be a natural synergy. If we're charging landlords, big landlords, a business fee, that should be going to sort of managing rentals. So, and if we're not, I guess I'd like to know more about that. This is the first I've heard about it. It wasn't part of the staff presentation, but I don't think we're talking about a new burden for staff or a new cost factor that would not be funded. People who are making money, we charge business licenses for other types of businesses, and that supports the work that staff do to support those businesses. So I kind of see this as similar, but I guess I'd like to hear more information, maybe at a future meeting, exactly how much money do we raise? Do we charge for these business licenses? How much money is that? How's it being spent? Because this is all kind of new information to me.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, to me, I think it's pretty clear where we want to go from here. And so with everyone's concurrence, I think we can call it a night. And
I had a question that I don't think was answered.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate it just real quick. I just was asking staff if we know how many rentals are owned by mom and pops versus companies.
No, we don't know.
No.
Okay, and I will just make one last comment in that I'm hopeful that, and this is a takeaway that I had from attending League of Cities last week, that we can be more intentional in regards to especially our outreach effort, but anytime we're implementing a policy, particularly in this space, that we're looking at it through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. And so how are we being intentional around reaching out to renters in communities of color and disadvantaged communities in general within our city to make sure that we're communicating the message to them, and we're also doing a decent job of hearing their voice as well. So hopefully we can figure out how that gets looped into this conversation. And I just wanted to share that here. Thank you, Mayor.
Good, very good. I'm glad you enjoy the League of Cities too. All right, so with that, as always, I want to thank our staff, our consultants, the public, and the City Council for making this really a productive, very stimulating meeting. And this is just the first step, and we'll continue stepping along. So I'll say good night to everybody, and thank you so much.
Pardon if we're going to adjourn to closed session or not, but if we are, we should take public comment on the closed session items. And if those are being
Forgotten
continued.
about that.
Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
I probably should even, okay, let's see. Thank you.
We actually do, Mr. Mayor, and Tom Rowley is here at the podium.
Okay, thanks. My bad, and I apologize. 3.5 solid hours takes its toll. So on me at least. So I thank you for bringing that to my attention. We will go to closed session, and if there's anyone in the public who wants to comment about our closed session items, this is your opportunity.
Tom Rowley, just a quick follow-up. I've spoken to you before. The first session, I think you had a hybrid session in June. I mentioned the issue that was raised and then withdrawn by Rick Hoyer, Rich Russello, and myself a year ago, suggesting that we needed to go to district elections. It's interesting to see the closed session item that's been added from LULAC, asking for the very same thing that we asked for, that we need to consider in a very, very careful way moving the city of Monterey into district elections. We're overdue for it. There's more than racial discrimination. There's economic discrimination. There's other types of unfair ways that we currently elect our officials. And I think that this has been known. It's very common knowledge of where the people have lived that have served at City Hall, up in the dais here, and on the Planning Commission. So I think this is something that you need to look at, and I hope you'll start the process so that hopefully by next spring, we could have gone through the process where we're ready to move to district elections. So I'm glad to see that somebody else brought this up. Anyway, we know there's another case coming from Santa Monica, but the problem is still here. It needs to be addressed. And I raised it a couple times, so you know what it is, and I hope you'll take action on it. So thanks a lot.
And that concludes public comment on this item here in the council chambers.
Link. So we'll again, thank you, everyone. We'll see you shortly.
It looks like we do have one raised hand on Zoom. I don't know if Clementine saw that. Gabriela Chavez, we will welcome you to public comment.
Oh, okay.
Hello, yes, this is Gabriela Chavez speaking again. I just wanted to chime in on this issue as well. As you all know, I ran for Monterey City Council in 2020, and part of the reason I was so inspired to do so was, wanting to diversify representation of Monterey City Council. Our city is a diverse population of generations and cultural backgrounds, and I don't think that our city council very accurately reflects that. I know that this issue has been brought up by different groups in the past, and it is a nuanced issue, but it is something that we definitely need to consider carefully to ensure that we really do give voice to all of the voters of Monterey and all the different neighborhoods and all the different backgrounds. And I do not have an affiliation with LULAC, but I am encouraged to see this being considered and brought to light by different groups and with different perspectives. And I'm hoping that the council will be open to talking to a lot of different community members about this issue moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriella. And that concludes public comment online as well. Mr. Mayor, back to you.
All right. Well, then we will adjourn. We'll see you shortly.